What could happen that people would still be trying to explain 5,000 years later? A disappearance with no trace. A civilization that suddenly falls silent. A discovery buried for centuries that raises more questions than answers. 5,000 years have passed. Empires have risen and disappeared, languages have been forgotten, and entire cities have been swallowed by the earth. Yet some mysteries survived alongside the ruins. A body with no clear explanation. A city abandoned without a warning. Ancient records describing events that still have no satisfying answer. Stories of disappearance, violence, strange beliefs, and unexplained events that have survived for 5,000 years. Tonight, we're uncovering the darkest of them. A clay tablet, roughly the size of a hand, sits under museum glass in the British Museum's Middle East Gallery, catalogued simply as K3375. Its surface is dense with cuneiform wedges, pressed into wet clay more than 2,600 years ago by a scribe working in the library of King Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. For centuries after the fall of that library, the tablet lay buried beneath the mounds of what is now northern Iraq, unread, its story unknown to anyone above ground. Then, in December 1872, a young Assyriologist named George Smith, working through crates of fragments in the basement of the museum, pieced together its lines and realized, with what colleagues later described as visible shock, that he was reading an account of a great flood. One that predated the book of Genesis by well over 1,000 years, and yet described in startling detail the same essential story. A warning from the gods, an ark, a chosen survivor, birds sent out to find dry land. Smith's discovery, part of what would come to be known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, forced 19th century scholars to confront an uncomfortable question, one that has never entirely gone away. If the flood story in Genesis was not unique, if a nearly identical narrative had been carved into clay in Mesopotamia centuries before Moses was believed to have lived, then where did the story actually come from? Was it myth borrowed and reshaped across cultures? Or was it something else? The fractured, retold memory of an event that genuinely happened, filtered through generations of oral tradition until it hardened into scripture. The Mesopotamian flood story itself has layers older than the tablet Smith translated. Fragments of an even earlier version, the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, and a related Akkadian account known as the Epic of Atrahasis, push the tradition back toward the early 2nd millennium BC, and possibly further, into oral traditions with no surviving written trace at all. In the Atrahasis version, the gods send the flood not as punishment for wickedness, as in Genesis, but because humanity has become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest, a detail that strikes modern readers as almost mundane, oddly bureaucratic, next to the moral weight of the biblical account. And yet the mechanics of the story are unmistakably similar. A warned man, a boat built to precise dimensions, animals brought aboard, a catastrophic inundation, and birds dispatched afterward to search for land. What makes this convergence more than a literary curiosity is how far it extends beyond the Near East. Flood narratives appear, independently as far as scholars can determine, in the mythologies of cultures with no plausible line of contact to Mesopotamia or to one another. In the Hindu story of Manu, preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana, in Chinese accounts of the flood tamed by the engineer King Yu, dated by tradition to roughly 2200 BC, in Mesoamerican codices describing a deluge that ends one world age and begins another. Among indigenous oral traditions across North America, from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes, in Aboriginal Australian stories passed down for millennia before any European contact. Folklorists have cataloged flood myths in several hundred distinct cultures worldwide. Some of this overlap is almost certainly explainable by simple human experience. Rivers flood, coastlines erode, catastrophic storms occur in nearly every inhabited region of the world, and it would be strange if flooding did not appear somewhere in the mythology of societies that lived, as most ancient societies did, along rivers and coasts. But the sheer geographic breadth of the tradition and the specific recurring details, divine warning, a vessel, survivors chosen to repopulate the world, have kept researchers returning to a harder question. Is there a shared point of origin, some genuinely catastrophic event or cluster of events lying beneath the myths? Geology offers, at minimum, real candidates. In 1998, the marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, both then at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, published a study proposing that around 5600 BC, rising waters from the Mediterranean breached a natural dam at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, pouring into a much smaller freshwater lake that occupied the Black Sea basin. According to their reconstruction, the incoming water may have raised the lake's level dramatically, and by some estimates rapidly, flooding tens of thousands of square kilometers of previously dry, likely inhabited, coastal land. The hypothesis was controversial from the moment it was published, and it remains so today. Subsequent research teams examining sediment cores from the Black Sea floor have reached different conclusions about how gradual or sudden the inundation actually was, with some studies suggesting the process unfolded over centuries, rather than in the sudden deluge Ryan and Pittman originally proposed. What no side of the debate disputes is that a substantial marine incursion into the Black Sea basin did occur in that general era. The geological evidence for the flooding itself is not in question, only its speed and its human impact. Other researchers have looked toward Mesopotamia's own alluvial plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have, throughout recorded history, been prone to catastrophic flooding during snowmelt season. In the 1920s, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating at the ancient Sumerian city of uncovered a layer of water-laid clay roughly 2.5 meters thick, sitting directly atop the remains of a settlement and directly beneath a later one. Woolley announced, with considerable public fanfare at the time, that he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood itself. Later archaeologists were more cautious. Excavations at other Sumerian sites, including Kish and Uruk, the very city named in the Sumerian flood tradition as the home of the flood survivor, revealed similar flood layers, but not all dating to the same period, and not on a scale that most archaeologists today would describe as regional, let alone global. The current scholarly consensus treats Woolley's flood layer as evidence of a severe, locally significant inundation, one substantial enough to have plausibly lodged itself in a community's collective memory, rather than proof of a single, civilization-ending deluge. This is, in many ways, where the mystery settles into its most persistent and most unresolved shape, not as a binary question of whether the flood happened exactly as any single text describes it, but as an open question about what kind of real event, or repeated pattern of events across centuries, across regions, could account for a memory so widely shared, so consistently structured, and so stubbornly persistent across cultures that, as far as the archaeological record shows, had no way of exchanging stories with one another. Some researchers working at the edges of oral history studies have proposed that certain widely dispersed flood traditions, including some indigenous Australian and Pacific Northwest accounts describing coastal land being swallowed by rising seas, may encode genuine memories of post-glacial sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, a process that, over several thousand years, submerged an area of coastal land worldwide larger than the continental United States. Whether oral tradition can genuinely preserve the memory of an environmental change spanning that many centuries and that many generations remains a matter of real scholarly disagreement, with some folklorists finding the idea plausible given documented cases of oral traditions preserving detailed astronomical and geological information over very long spans, and others considering it an appealing but ultimately unprovable stretch of comparative mythology. What remains in the end is a tablet under glass in London, a flood layer buried beneath the mounds of sediment cores pulled from the floor of the Black Sea, and several hundred stories, told in languages that never touched one another, describing, in their own words, water rising over everything a people had ever known. Was there one flood, remembered and refracted differently by each civilization that inherited its memory? Were there many floods, unconnected, each producing its own independent myth through nothing more than the shared vulnerability of every river valley civilization to catastrophic water? Or is the true origin of the story something science has not yet identified at all? Buried perhaps beneath a layer of silt that no excavation has reached, or beneath a stretch of seafloor that no research vessel has yet surveyed. The tablet that George Smith translated in 1872 answered one question, and in doing so, opened a much larger one that remains, more than a century and a half later, still without a final answer. That flood layer at the 2.5 meters of water-laid clay that Leonard Woolley uncovered in the 1920s, turns out to mark more than a geological event. Just above it, in the stratigraphy of the site, and in the wider Sumerian literary tradition that grew up around cities like Uruk, and Kish, sits a text that treats the flood not as myth, but as a hinge in real history. A single line, easy to miss, that divides the past into before the flood and after the flood. That text is the Sumerian king list, and the line is only the beginning of its strangeness. The king list survives today in some 18 known copies and fragments, inscribed on clay prisms and tablets, the most complete of which, the Weld Blundell prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, was acquired in 1922 and dates to around 1800 BC. It is written in Sumerian cuneiform, and its structure is, at first glance, exactly what a modern historian would want from an ancient administrative document. A sequential list of cities where kingship was said to reside, each with a roster of kings and the length of their reigns, one dynasty handing off power to the next in an orderly, unbroken chain. For historians, this alone made the king list an object of enormous interest from the moment scholars began translating it in the late 19th century. It offered something rare for the period, a chronological backbone, a way of ordering the deep past of Mesopotamia into a single continuous sequence, city by city, reign by reign. And for the dynasties closer to its own time of composition, the list has proven remarkably useful. Kings such as Sargon of Akkad, who founded the Akkadian Empire around 2334 BC, appear in the king list in roughly the position and sequence that independent evidence, royal inscriptions, administrative tablets, year names used to date economic documents, confirms. Archaeologists excavating at sites like Kish, and Lagash have recovered contemporary inscriptions from many of the later kings named in the list, allowing their reigns to be cross-checked, adjusted, and in most cases, broadly corroborated. Used carefully, the king list has genuinely helped reconstruct the political history of early Mesopotamia. It is the opening section of the list, the section covering the kings who supposedly reigned before the flood, where the document stops behaving like a historical record and starts behaving like something else entirely. According to the king list, kingship first descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, where a king named Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. He was followed by Alalgar, who reigned for 36,000 years. Across the 8, in some versions 10, antediluvian kings named in the list, spread across 5 cities, the reigns total, in the most commonly cited version, 241,200 years. Then, in the text's own words, the flood swept over, and kingship descended again from heaven, this time to the city of Kish, and the reign lengths, while still elevated by any ordinary historical standard, drop sharply into the hundreds and then the tens of years, gradually settling over the following dynasties into figures that read as entirely plausible for human kings. What are modern historians to make of numbers like these? The most straightforward and most widely accepted explanation treats the antediluvian reigns as a scribal or ideological convention rather than a claim of literal fact. A way of signaling that the pre-flood era belonged to a different category of time altogether. A mythic age, before the flood reset the world and ordinary measurable human history began. Some Assyriologists have pointed to the base 60 numerical system used in Sumerian mathematics and noted that several of the reign lengths are suspiciously round within that system, multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian Great Unit, known as Asar. Alulim's 28,800 years, for instance, is exactly 8 Sars. Under this reading, the list's compilers were not trying to record history in the antediluvian section at all. They were encoding something closer to cosmological or numerological symbolism, using the vocabulary of kingship and reign length the way other ancient traditions use genealogies or ages of the world. And yet this explanation, while reasonable, does not fully resolve why the transition is structured the way it is. Why an otherwise functional administrative genre, one that elsewhere in the same document tracks real historical dynasties with real corroborating evidence, would suddenly, deliberately, mark a boundary at the flood and use those specific enormous numbers to do it. Why does the pattern break exactly there? And why does it break in a downward direction so gradual that the transition from mythic to plausible reign lengths take several dynasties to complete, rather than snapping cleanly from one register to the other? A further layer of the mystery lies in what the king list conspicuously does not do. Unlike a modern chronicle, it does not present multiple dynasties as ruling simultaneously in different cities, even though archaeological evidence makes clear that several Sumerian city-states were, in fact, contemporaneous with one another for long stretches of the 3rd millennium BC. Instead, the list presents kingship as a single, portable authority, residing in only one city at a time, passed, almost always following a military defeat, from one city to the next in sequence. Most historians read this as a political and ideological framing device, a document composed, most likely under the 3rd dynasty of or shortly after, around 2100 to 2000 BC, to legitimize a particular ruling house by presenting the scattered competing city-states of Sumer's actual history as a single, unbroken, divinely sanctioned succession. Whether this flattening of overlapping dynasties into one continuous line was a matter of political convenience, religious conviction, or an older tradition the compilers themselves no longer fully understood, is a question the surviving copies do not answer. The comparison to other ancient traditions of extraordinarily long-lived early rulers, the antediluvian patriarchs of Genesis, some of whom are recorded as living for centuries, or the vastly extended reigns attributed to Egypt's mythical pre-dynastic rulers in later king lists compiled by the priest Merneith, has not gone unnoticed by scholars, and it raises a question that no single discipline has been able to settle on its own. Is this a case of independent cultures arriving by coincidence at a shared symbolic language for describing a remote, prehistorical past? Or does it point to something shared between these traditions? A common source, a common event, a common reason for marking time before a flood is categorically different from time after it, that has not yet been identified. The Weld Blundell Prism sits in its case in Oxford today, its 4 inscribed faces still holding a sequence of names and numbers that historians have spent more than a century trying to fully decode. Most of the list, especially in its later sections, has earned its place as a genuine historical source. But that opening column, 8 kings, 5 cities, 200 years, remains something else. A place where the ancient scribes seem to be telling us, quite deliberately, that we have crossed out of history and into something they themselves may not have fully been able to explain either. Some 600 miles southwest of the mounds of Kish and across the Sinai and along the banks of a different river, a slate pallet roughly 2 feet tall was uncovered in 1897 by British archaeologists James Quibell and Frederick Green, buried within the temple precinct of the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. Carved from a single piece of siltstone and covered on both faces with tightly organized registers of figures, it would become one of the most reproduced objects in all of Egyptology, appearing in nearly every textbook account of how Egypt began. It is known today as the Narmer palette, and it sits now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, still debated, still incomplete in what it can actually tell us, more than a century after it was pulled from the ground. The palette shows a king, identified by a Seqed, a rectangular hieroglyphic frame, bearing the name Narmer, wearing on one face the white crown associated with Upper Egypt, and on the reverse, the red crown associated with Lower Egypt. On one side, he strikes down a kneeling enemy with a raised mace. On the other, he strides in procession, apparently reviewing rows of decapitated captives, standards held aloft before him. For generations of Egyptologists, beginning with the object's earliest interpreters at the turn of the 20th century, this was read as nothing less than a visual record of a founding event. The moment one king, wearing both crowns, forged Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom around 3100 BC, inaugurating what history would come to call the First Dynasty. It is a satisfying story, and a great deal of it rests on genuinely solid ground. The name Narmer appears not only on this palette, but on ivory labels, pottery, and seal impressions recovered from sites across Egypt, including the royal necropolis at Abydos, where archaeologists have identified what is widely believed to be his tomb. Radiocarbon analysis of material from the Abydos Royal Cemetery, published in a comprehensive dating study led by Michael D. and colleagues at the University of Oxford in 2013, places the beginning of the First Dynasty at approximately 3100 BC, a figure that broadly aligns with the traditional placement of Narmer at or near Egypt's political unification. The archaeological record also confirms, independent of any single object, that Egypt genuinely was divided into distinct cultural spheres before this period. The Naqada culture in the south, with its own pottery traditions, its own elite burials, its own centers of power at Naqada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis, developing along a trajectory visibly different from the lower Egyptian cultures of the Delta. And yet the closer Egyptologists have looked at the actual mechanics of unification, the less the story resembles a single triumphant moment captured on a single carved stone, and the more it resembles a process, one whose true beginning may lie further back than Narmer, and whose central actor may not be him at all. The complication begins with a name that appears nowhere on the Narmer palette, but that shows up tantalizingly on other objects from roughly the same period: Scorpion. A macehead, discovered by the same Quebel Green expedition at Hierakonpolis in 1898, depicts a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, identified by a scorpion glyph beside his figure, engaged in what appears to be a ceremonial act connected to irrigation or land reclamation. A ruler, in other words, already exercising the visual and symbolic authority of kingship. Whether this King Scorpion reigned immediately before Narmer, was a rival contemporary, or represents an entirely separate figure from a slightly earlier phase now sometimes called Dynasty Zero, remains unresolved. Further complicating matters, a set of tomb inscriptions and rock carvings discovered decades later at sites including Gebel Chowdi and Gebel Sheikh Suleiman in southern Egypt and lower Nubia have been interpreted by some archaeologists, including Egyptologist Günter Dreyer of the German Archaeological Institute, as evidence of military campaigns and territorial claims by Naqada period rulers who predate Narmer by potentially decades or more, rulers whose names survive only as fragmentary serects, some not yet confidently read at all. This has pushed a significant portion of the Egyptological community toward a considerably more cautious position than the one that prevailed a century ago. That unification was not an event, but a process, unfolding across the reigns of several late pre-dynastic and Dynasty Zero rulers, among them Iry-Hor, Ka, and the figure known as Scorpion, each apparently extending Upper Egyptian control northward through some combination of conquest, alliance, and economic integration, well before Narmer's reign began. Under this reading, Narmer may not be the founder of unified Egypt so much as its most effectively commemorated ruler, the king whose reign happened to produce an object, the palette, vivid and legible enough to survive in the popular and scholarly imagination as the origin point, even if the actual work of unification had been substantially completed, or at least well underway by his predecessors. There is also a harder, more fundamental question lurking beneath all of this, one that recent scholarship has increasingly foregrounded. How literally should the Narmer palette even be read? Ceremonial and commemorative objects of this period were not necessarily intended as documentary records in the modern sense. The smiting pose Narmer adopts on the palette, one arm raised, mace poised above a captive's head, appears again and again in Egyptian royal art for the next 3,000 years, deployed by kings who were not at the moment of carving engaged in any specific historical battle at all. It had become, by later periods, a generic symbol of royal power and cosmic order rather than a record of a particular event. If later pharaohs could adopt this imagery purely symbolically, Egyptologists have increasingly asked, how confident can anyone be that Narmer's own version depicts an actual campaign of conquest, rather than a ceremonial or ideological statement about kingship itself? One that may be commemorating, rather than performing, a unification substantially achieved before he ever took the throne? No new palette has surfaced to settle the question. No tomb inscription has emerged naming beyond dispute a single ruler as the one who first joined the two lands. What the archaeological record offers instead is a widening cast of shadowy figures: Iry-Hor, Ka, Scorpion, Narmer, each holding a fragment of a story that no single artifact has yet managed to tell in full. Was Narmer the man who completed a unification generations in the making, the last king in a line of gradual conquest whose predecessors' names have simply not survived in a form we can read? Or does the truth lie buried still, in a tomb not yet opened, a Seqed not yet deciphered, somewhere beneath the sands between Abydos and the Delta, waiting for the archaeologist who finally reads the name that came before all the others? Some miles south, where the Nile narrows and the desert presses closer to the water's edge, the land remembers a different kind of silence. Here, beneath the modern town of Abydos, the sand holds one of Egypt's oldest and least understood secrets. Older than the pyramids, older than the great dynasties that would one day carve their names into eternity. It is here, among the earliest royal tombs ever built in the Nile Valley, that we find the trace of a ruler who existed at the very edge of recorded time. A king known to us only by the symbol he chose to represent himself: a scorpion. He is called by modern convention Scorpion Seqed, a name we have given him because we do not truly know what he called himself. Sometime around 3200 to 3100 BC, in the period historians call Dynasty 0, before Egypt was fully Egypt, before the first pharaoh of the first dynasty stood at the helm of a unified kingdom, this man ruled over Upper Egypt. Or perhaps he did not rule so much as he fought to rule. That distinction, as we will see, is part of what makes his story so difficult to pin down. What do we actually have of him? Fragments. A limestone mace head, shattered and painstakingly reassembled, discovered in 1897 at Hierakonpolis by British archaeologists James Quibell and Frederick Green. On its curved surface, a procession. Workers, standards, a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, bent over what appears to be an irrigation canal, a hoe in his hands. Above his head, a rosette and a scorpion, the symbols archaeologists have come to read as his name. It is one of the earliest images of Egyptian kingship we possess. And yet the object that names him also refuses to explain him. Was this scene a real ceremony? A king breaking ground on an irrigation project, asserting his command over the life-giving river? Or was it symbolic, a ritual performance meant to project the illusion of control over the Nile's flood, a force no mortal king could truly command? Scholars remain divided. The Scorpion Macehead, as it is now known, tells us that a king named Scorpion existed, that he held power, that his artists wished him remembered doing something significant with water and land. It does not tell us how he died. It does not even tell us with certainty how long he lived. The mystery deepens at el-Ka'ab, the necropolis of Abydos, where the kings of this shadowy pre-dynastic age were buried in mud-brick tombs beneath the desert floor. In 1988, a German archaeological team led by Günter Dreyer began excavating a tomb designated UJ, a structure larger and more elaborate than anything that had come before it in that cemetery. Inside, they found hundreds of wine jars, imported from the Levant, arranged with what seemed like deliberate care. They found small ivory and bone labels, some of the earliest examples of writing, or proto-writing, ever discovered in Egypt, marking commodities, perhaps recording taxation, perhaps something more. And they found, scattered among the grave goods, ivory scepters carved in the shape of a scorpion. Was this the tomb of the same king depicted on the macehead? Many Egyptologists believe so, though the identification is not universally accepted. Some argue UJ belonged to an earlier, entirely different scorpion, and that at least two kings may have used the same symbol across the generations, their identities blurring together in the archaeological record until we can no longer be certain which fragments belong to which man. It is a strange kind of erasure, not the erasure of destruction, but the erasure of resemblance, where two rulers separated by decades or more begin to look, to us, like one. And what of the body itself? Here the trail grows fainter still. Unlike the later pharaohs of the great dynasties, whose mummified remains would eventually be studied, scanned, and in some cases identified down to the physical circumstances of their deaths, no confirmed skeletal remains of Scorpion II have ever been positively identified and analyzed. Tomb Uj, like nearly every royal tomb of this era, had been plundered in antiquity, its contents disturbed, its human remains lost to time or looters, or the simple collapse of unfired brick under thousands of years of desert pressure. We are left asking a question that has no answer we can currently retrieve. How did a king who commanded enough resources to import wine from foreign lands, who commissioned some of the first writing in his civilization's history, who may have laid symbolic claim to the waters of the Nile itself, how did such a man meet his end? Was it violence, in an age when the unification of Egypt was still being fought over, region by region, chieftain by chieftain? Some researchers have pointed to the turbulence of the period, a landscape of competing proto-kingdoms, of Nakata and Hierakonpolis, and this vying for dominance, as evidence that early rulers of this kind rarely died peacefully in their beds. Others suggest something more mundane: disease, age, the simple fragility of life in the ancient world, where even a king had no defense against infection or a bad harvest year. And a smaller number of voices, working at the fringes of accepted scholarship, have wondered whether the scorpion symbol itself carried a darker resonance, whether a king who took the name of one of the desert's most feared creatures did so not merely as a boast of power, but as a ward against something he feared in return. It is speculation only, unsupported by any inscription we possess, and it should be weighed as such. But the question, once asked, is not easily set aside. What remains certain is this: somewhere beneath the sands of Abydos, or perhaps lost entirely to the plunder of millennia, lies the true story of a man who stood at the very dawn of Egyptian civilization, a man whose name we cannot pronounce, whose face we have never seen, whose death has left no trace we have yet managed to find. Every king who followed him, every pyramid, every golden mask, exists in some sense because of what he and rulers like him began. And yet he himself remains almost entirely a silhouette. Perhaps one day the sand will give up what it is still holding. Until then, the scorpion waits, carved in ivory, painted in limestone, and utterly silent on the matter of how its bearer came to leave this world. That carved scorpion, silent and unyielding, is not the last symbol to leave us guessing. A few miles north of where it was found, in the same city of Hierakonpolis, another carved stone was pulled from the earth in that same excavation season of 1897-98, a stone that would become one of the most famous objects in all of Egyptology, and one of its most persistent puzzles. This is the Narmer palette, a shield-shaped slab of gray-green siltstone, just over 2 feet tall, its two faces covered in some of the earliest and most sophisticated relief carving Egypt would ever produce. And at its center stands a king, captured in the act of conquest, a king whose name may or may not be the answer to a question that has occupied historians for more than a century. Was Narmer the same man history remembers as Menes, the legendary founder of a unified Egypt? To understand why this question matters, we have to understand what Menes was supposed to be. Centuries later, the Egyptian priest and historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BC, compiled a history of Egypt's kings for his Greek-speaking rulers. In it, he named Menes as the very first pharaoh, the man who united the warring lands of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom, who founded the city of Memphis at the hinge point between the two, and who set in motion the civilization that would go on to raise pyramids and rule the Nile for 3,000 years. Herodotus, the Greek historian, had heard similar accounts on his travels and recorded them a century before Manetho. For a long time, Menes stood as Egypt's founding father, a name carried down through king lists carved on temple walls, through the Turin papyrus, through the Palermo stone, always first, always foundational, and yet always in the historical record, curiously, without a face. Because here is the difficulty. No contemporary inscription from Egypt's earliest dynastic period says the name Menes. Not on the Narmer palette, not in any of the royal tombs at Abydos. The name appears only in later sources, written centuries, in some cases well over 1,000 years, after the events it claims to describe. So when archaeologists began uncovering the actual physical evidence of Egypt's first kings in the tombs of Ka'ab and in objects like the Narmer palette, they were left holding a puzzle with no label. The names carved into the stone by the people who lived that history, Narmer, and possibly a king called Hor-Aha found buried nearby, did not match the name passed down by tradition. Someone was missing, or someone had two names. Look closely at the Narmer palette itself, and the case for identification is compelling. On one face, the king wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and strikes down an enemy with a raised mace, a falcon hovering above symbolizing the god Horus's endorsement of the act. On the reverse, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, walking in procession before the bodies of the defeated. Here, carved in stone around 3100 BC, is a visual claim to something extraordinary, the joining of two kingdoms under a single ruler. It is, many Egyptologists argue, a symbolic record. Perhaps not a literal battle, but a declaration of political unification, of precisely the achievement that later tradition would credit to Menes. The logic seems to close the gap neatly. Narmer conquered and unified. Menes united Egypt. Therefore, Narmer was Menes, and Menes may simply have been a title or epithet, meaning something like "he who endures," used alongside his birth name, in keeping with the Egyptian custom of pharaohs holding multiple names throughout their reigns. But the evidence resists such a tidy resolution. Some scholars have proposed instead that Menes was not Narmer, but his successor, Hor-Aha, whose tomb at Abydos lies close to Narmer's and who may have completed whatever unification his predecessor began. Ivory labels found in Hor-Aha's tomb bear a curious inscription some researchers have read as pairing his name with the word men, tantalizingly close to Mens, though the interpretation is far from settled among specialists. Still others have questioned whether Menes was ever a single historical person at all, suggesting he may be a composite figure, a legendary telescoping of several early rulers into one founding myth. The way later cultures often condense a messy, gradual process of state formation into the story of a single, heroic founder. Unification, after all, was almost certainly not the work of one campaign or one king. The archaeological record suggests a slow convergence of power across generations, the Nakata culture of the south absorbing or subduing its northern neighbors over an extended and poorly documented span of time. If that is true, then Menes may be less a person than a symbol, a name Egyptians gave centuries later to a process too complicated and too distant to remember accurately. There is also the darker, more fragmentary tradition recorded by later Egyptian and Greco-Roman writers, that Menes did not die peacefully after his great triumph, but was killed by a hippopotamus while out on his own Nile marshes, dragged from his boat by the very river that had made his kingdom possible. Herodotus mentions nothing of this, but later sources do, and Egyptologists have long debated whether this detail preserves some authentic, ancient memory, however distorted, or whether it is simply the kind of moralizing legend that accumulates around founding figures across many cultures, a reminder that even the man who tamed a kingdom could not tame the wild. What we are left with, then, is a name without a certain face, and perhaps a face without a certain name. Narmer stands before us in stone, mace raised, crowns doubled, unmistakably a king of consequence. Menace stands before us in text, first in every list, credited with an empire's birth, yet strangely absent from the very monuments that should confirm him. Are they the same man, remembered under two identities by two different traditions separated by 1,000 years of retelling? Or does the true founder of Egypt still wait somewhere in the sand, his name lost entirely, while later generations quietly assigned his glory to whichever king they could still name? The palette does not answer. It only watches, as it has for 5,000 years, while we continue to ask who exactly we are looking at. Follow the same river of questions eastward now, across the Sinai and the Levant, past the edge of the world the Egyptians knew, to another river valley entirely, where the Tigris and Euphrates cut through the flat, sun-baked plain of southern Mesopotamia. Here, in what is now southern Iraq, lie the eroded mounds of Uruk, once the largest city human beings had ever built. Walk its ruins today and you find little more than weathered brick and wind-blown dust, the ziggurat of Etana reduced to a low ochre hill. But 5,000 years ago, this was arguably the beating heart of the world, a city of tens of thousands, home to monumental temples, the world's first known writing system, and a civilization so advanced that its influence, archaeologists have found, stretched hundreds of miles in every direction. And then, within a few centuries, it fell into a decline so steep and so puzzling that historians are still arguing over what exactly happened. Uruk's rise had been staggering. By around 3500 BC, the city had grown into something the ancient world had not yet seen. An urban settlement covering perhaps 250 hectares, ringed eventually by defensive walls that later legend would attribute to the hero king Gilgamesh himself. Its temple precincts, dedicated to the goddess Inanna and the sky god Anu, rose in tiered platforms of mud brick, decorated with cone mosaics pressed into intricate geometric patterns. Its administrators, faced with the challenge of managing surplus grain, livestock, and labor on an unprecedented scale, developed something revolutionary. Small clay tablets marked first with pictographs, then with the wedge-shaped signs we now call cuneiform. Writing, as far as the evidence shows us, was born here, not as literature or philosophy, but as an accounting tool, a way to track who owed what to whom. It is a detail worth sitting with. Civilization's first written words were not poems. They were receipts. This system worked, and worked well, for centuries. The Uruk period, as archaeologists call it, saw the emergence of what some scholars describe as an early colonial network. Uruk-style pottery, architecture, and administrative technology appearing at outposts hundreds of miles away. From Susa in modern Iran to sites along the Euphrates deep into Syria and southeastern Anatolia. Some researchers have called this the Uruk expansion, and the word expansion is doing careful work there, because no one is entirely certain what it means. Was this a trade network, extending Uruk's reach through commerce and the exchange of goods like textiles and grain? Was it a form of soft colonization, with Uruk elites establishing formal outposts to secure resources, timber, metal, precious stones, that the resource-poor floodplain of southern Mesopotamia lacked? Or does the archaeological footprint simply reflect the appeal of a superior administrative technology, spreading the way an idea spreads without armies or formal control at all? The tablets themselves overwhelmingly record economic transactions rather than military conquests, which has left the question of Uruk's true relationship with its far-flung outposts remarkably open. And then, around 3100 to 3000 BC, it began to unravel. The outposts were abandoned or destroyed in relatively short order. Sites like Habuba Kabira in Syria, once thriving Uruk colonies, were left empty. Within Mesopotamia itself, the following period, what archaeologists label the Jimdet Nasr period, transitioning into the early dynastic era, shows a landscape fracturing into competing city-states. Kish, Lagash, Nippur, each asserting its own identity, its own patron deity, increasingly fortified against its neighbors. The grand, seemingly coordinated Uruk world dissolves into something more contested, more violent, more local. What caused a network that had taken centuries to build to come apart so quickly? The most widely accepted explanations point to the land itself. Southern Mesopotamia's prosperity depended entirely on irrigation drawn from the Tigris and Euphrates, and that dependency was fragile. Some researchers have proposed that centuries of irrigation gradually salinized the soil, poisoning fields that had once produced abundant grain surpluses. The very surpluses that had funded Uruk's temples, its bureaucracy, its expansion. Others point to shifts in the river's courses, which in this flat alluvial plain could abandon a city's fields entirely within a human lifetime, leaving canals dry and settlements stranded. Climate data drawn from lake sediments and cave formations across the wider region suggests the possibility of a broader aridification trend beginning around this time, part of a pattern of climatic instability that some scholars connect to a series of societal disruptions across the ancient Near East. Was Uruk, then, simply a victim of its own environment? A city that had built its greatness on a foundation the climate itself would not sustain? Other explanations reach toward more contested territory. Some scholars have suggested that the very success of the Uruk network sowed the seeds of its own unraveling, that outposts established to extract resources eventually accumulated enough local power and knowledge to break away, taking Uruk's own administrative innovations and turning them toward independent ambitions. It is a pattern historians have observed in later empires, though whether it applies here remains a matter of interpretation rather than proof. And at the furthest edges of speculation, a small number of writers have pointed to the sheer scale and suddenness of the disruption, and wondered whether some more catastrophic event, a war unrecorded in any surviving text, a plague moving through a densely packed city with no immunity to it, might explain a collapse this broad. The tablets, tellingly, are silent on the matter. A civilization that invented writing to track its grain left us no ledger of its own undoing. What remains is a plain of mounds, a scattering of clay tablets recording debts that were never collected from cities that no longer existed to collect them, and a question that has outlived every answer offered for it. The world's first city built an empire of ideas that reached farther than any army of its time. And then, in the space of a few generations, that world came apart, leaving no explanation carved anywhere for those who would come looking. What exactly broke first? The land, the network, or something else entirely we have not yet learned to read in the ruins? A civilization that invents writing and still leaves no explanation for its own collapse. We have already encountered that particular silence once, on the plains of Mesopotamia. It turns out Uruk did not hold a monopoly on it. Return now to the Nile, to the same dusty ridge at Abydos where the scorpion once waited in its tomb, and the same unnerving quiet greets us again, this time surrounding the birth of a kingdom rather than its unraveling. Stand today among the low mud-brick ruins of al-Ka'ab, and it is difficult to reconcile this modest, wind-scoured cemetery with what it represents, the birthplace of the longest-lived civilization the ancient world would ever know. Somewhere around 3100 BC, a line of kings we now call the First Dynasty began to rule over a unified Egypt, stretching from the delta in the north to the first cataract of the Nile in the south. Within a few generations, their successors would command enough labor and grain surplus to raise the first pyramids. And yet the founding of this dynasty, the actual mechanics of how a patchwork of competing chiefdoms became one of history's first true nation-states, remains one of the most stubbornly unresolved questions in all of Egyptology. The broad outline is not in serious dispute. Before the First Dynasty, Egypt was not one country but several overlapping spheres of power. The Naqada culture in the south, centered around sites like Hierakonpolis and Naqada itself. A less well-understood set of communities in the delta to the north, influenced by different trade networks reaching toward the Levant, and smaller regional centers scattered along the river between them. Over the course of what archaeologists call the Naqada II and Naqada III periods, roughly 3500 to 3100 BC, these separate worlds began to draw together. Through trade, through cultural exchange, and, the evidence increasingly suggests, through conquest. Grave goods grow more elaborate. Settlements grow fortified. Symbols of kingship, like the white crown and later the combined crowns of the two lands, begin appearing in the archaeological record before any king we can name with certainty wore them. Something was consolidating. The question is how and at whose hand. This is where the trail begins to thin. The royal tombs of el-Ka'ab, excavated first by Emile Amelino in the 1890s and later, more carefully, by Flinders Petrie, and most recently re-examined by the German Archaeological Institute under Günter Dreyer, preserve the names of a sequence of kings: Narmer, Hor-Aha, Djer, Djet, Den, and others, who together make up the first dynasty as we understand it. But the tombs themselves raise as many questions as they answer. Around the burial chambers of these early kings, archaeologists have found row upon row of smaller subsidiary graves, dozens in some cases, over 100 in others, containing servants, courtiers, and even dwarfs and dogs, all seemingly buried at the same time as their king. The uncomfortable implication, one that most Egyptologists now accept, is that these attendants were sacrificed to accompany their ruler into death, a practice that appears abruptly with the first dynasty and just as abruptly vanishes by the dynasty's end. What could account for a custom this severe, one so at odds with the more restrained funerary practices Egypt would later become known for? Was it a display of absolute royal authority meant to awe a newly conquered population still uncertain of its king's power? A genuine belief in the necessity of a full royal household in the afterlife? The tombs preserve the bodies. They do not preserve the reasoning. Then there is the matter of how, precisely, the unification itself was achieved. Whether it happened in one decisive campaign, memorialized perhaps in the Narmer Palate's scenes of conquest, or whether it was a slower, more uneven process of alliance, marriage, and gradual absorption stretching across several reigns and even before Narmer's own time. Some Egyptologists have pointed to evidence of a dynasty zero, kings like Iry-Hor and Ka, buried at Abydos before Narmer, whose names appear on pottery and seals, but who are entirely absent from the later Egyptian king lists compiled by priests centuries afterward. If these rulers existed and governed a proto-unified or partially unified Egypt before Narmer's reign, why were they erased from the official memory the Egyptians themselves chose to preserve? Was their unification incomplete and therefore unworthy of commemoration? Or does the omission suggest something more deliberate? A later dynasty rewriting its own origin story to begin more cleanly, more triumphantly, with a single founding hero rather than a messy sequence of forgotten precursors. At the furthest edges of the discussion, a handful of researchers have asked even more fundamental questions about outside influence during this formative period, pointing to Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals, certain artistic motifs, and architectural techniques like the paneled palace facade brickwork that appear in Egypt around this same time, seemingly without local precedent. Mainstream Egyptology generally explains these as evidence of trade contact and cultural borrowing across the ancient Near East, part of the same web of exchange that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia and the Levant during this period. But the precise mechanism, merchants, migrating craftsmen, something else, is still debated, and the appearance of these foreign elements at exactly the moment Egypt was consolidating into a state has struck some observers as more than coincidental, even if the evidence for any stronger claim remains thin. What we are ultimately left with is a nation that emerges from the archaeological darkness already formed, already writing, already burying its kings with a retinue of the dead, already reaching toward Mesopotamia and the Levant for reasons still not fully understood. The men who built this kingdom left us their names, their tombs, and their symbols of authority. What they did not leave us is an account in their own words of how it was done. Perhaps that story was never written down at all, or perhaps it was, and simply has not yet been found beneath the sand that still covers so much of Abydos, waiting, like so much else from this age, to be read. Centuries would pass before Egypt's silence found an echo across the desert in the cuneiform archives of Mesopotamia, where scribes, writing long after the fact, preserved the memory of a king so ancient that even they seemed uncertain whether they were recording history or myth. His name was Etana, and on a fragmentary clay tablet housed today in the British Museum, part of a much larger collection of Sumerian king list copies excavated from sites across ancient Iraq. His name appears with a description unlike almost any other ruler in that long roster of kings: the shepherd who ascended to heaven. To understand why that phrase matters, we have to understand what the Sumerian king list actually is. Composed sometime in the early 2nd millennium BC, though clearly drawing on much older oral and written traditions, the list purports to record every king who ruled Mesopotamia from the moment kingship descended from heaven down through the historical dynasties the compilers themselves would have recognized. It is, in places, plainly legendary. Early kings are credited with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, a detail that has led most scholars to treat the list's earliest entries with considerable caution. And yet the list is not pure invention either. As it moves into its later sections, the names it records increasingly correspond to kings we can independently verify through other inscriptions, seals, and administrative records. Somewhere in the murky space between myth and verified history sits Etana, listed as a king of the city of Kish, reigning, according to the text, in the period after a great flood had supposedly swept across the land. That detail alone places Etana in extraordinarily deep time, potentially in the early centuries of the 3rd millennium BC, in the same general era we have already been circling in this exploration, when Uruk's network was unraveling and Egypt's first kings were consolidating power along the Nile. Was Kish, under a king like Etana, one of the earliest true cities to claim a form of kingship over its neighbors in the wake of Uruk's fragmentation? Some historians have proposed exactly that as Uruk's influence contracted, cities like Kish rose to fill the resulting vacuum, and that Etana, whatever the embellishments later attached to his name, may represent a real historical figure from that specific window of upheaval. Whether the fragments of pottery and building foundations excavated at the mound of Tel Aluhaymir, ancient Kish, can be tied to any specific ruler from this period remains uncertain, but the city's early prominence is not in doubt. It appears repeatedly in later Mesopotamian tradition as one of the first seats of kingship after the flood, and King of Kish would go on to become a coveted title claimed by rulers long after the city's own political power had faded, a kind of honorary echo of primacy that outlasted the city's actual dominance for centuries. But it is the myth surrounding Etana, more than any archaeological trace of him, that has kept his name alive for 4,000 years. In the Sumerian and later Akkadian versions of the Etana legend, preserved on tablets copied and recopied across many centuries, the king is described as childless, desperate for an heir, and searching for a magical plant capable of granting fertility. To find it, he rescues an eagle that has been trapped in a pit after breaking a sacred oath with a serpent, and in gratitude, the eagle offers to carry him upward into the sky, toward the throne of the gods, in search of the plant of birth. Later fragments describe the ascent itself in vivid, almost vertiginous detail. The king looking down as the earth shrinks beneath him, first to the size of a threshing floor, then to a mere speck lost among the clouds, before the surviving tablets break off, damaged and incomplete, leaving the ending of the flight itself lost to us. Did Etana succeed in reaching the heavens? Did he fall? The tablets that would tell us are broken precisely at the moment we most want them to speak. It is tempting, and more than a few writers over the past century have found it irresistible, to read this ascent as something more than allegory. To wonder whether an eagle carrying a king toward the sky preserves the distorted memory of an actual event, however implausible that might sound stripped of its mythic framing. Mainstream Assyriologists overwhelmingly treat the tale as exactly what its genre suggests: a piece of royal mythology concerned with fertility, legitimacy, and the anxiety of a king without an heir, using the ancient and widespread motif of a journey to the heavens to dramatize a very earthly problem: the survival of a royal line. And yet the persistence of the story, copied and preserved across more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian scribal tradition, tells us that this was not a minor tale. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian period, centuries after Etana's supposed reign, depict a man being borne aloft on the back of an eagle, a scene many scholars connect directly to his legend, suggesting that whatever core memory or meaning the story carried, it mattered enough to Mesopotamians across many generations to keep carving it into stone. What then do we actually possess of Etana? A name on a list that blends history and legend without clearly marking the boundary between them. A city, Kish, whose early primacy in Mesopotamian tradition is well attested even where its individual kings are not. And a myth, broken at its most crucial moment, about a childless king who reached for the heavens in search of something the earth could not give him. Was he a real ruler of a real city, remembered and reshaped by centuries of retelling into something closer to legend? Or was he always something else entirely? A symbol given a king's name, a story about mortal limitation dressed in the trappings of history. The tablet ends mid-flight, and so, in a sense, does our certainty about the man who may or may not have taken that journey at all. Picture the wind moving across a flat expanse of mounded earth in central Iraq, carrying with it a fine grit that has buried and reburied this place for thousands of years. Somewhere beneath that shifting surface, at the site the ancients called Kish and modern maps mark as Tel Aluhaimir, lie the remains of a city that Mesopotamian tradition itself named as the very first seat of kingship to exist after the Great Flood. We have already met one of its rulers in passing, Etana, the shepherd king who reached for the heavens. But Etana was not, according to the tradition that preserves him, the first king of Kish. He was merely the 12th, and the 11 names that came before him plunge us into an even deeper and more uncertain darkness. The Sumerian king list, that remarkable and maddening document compiled sometime in the early 2nd millennium BC from older sources now lost to us, opens its account of the post-Diluvian world, the age after the flood, with the simple, almost startling declaration that kingship descended from heaven a second time, and that it descended upon Kish. What follows is a roll call of names: Jushur, Kulasina Bel, Nangishlishma, Enatarzi, Babum, Puanum, Kalebum, Kalumum, Zukakip, Atab, Mashta, and Arwium, before finally arriving at Etana. Each is credited with a reign of implausible length, some running into the hundreds or even thousands of years. Taken at face value, this is clearly not a historical record in the sense we would recognize, and yet dismissing it outright would mean discarding something else the list quietly hands us: the memory that a real city, in a real location, was widely believed by later Mesopotamians to have been the first place where organized kingship, in whatever early and fragile form it took, actually began. What makes Kish's claim to primacy so difficult to simply set aside is what archaeologists have actually recovered from the ground itself. Excavations at Tel Aluhaimir and nearby mounds, carried out across the 20th century by French and other international teams, have revealed occupation layers stretching back into the Jemdet Nasser period, roughly the centuries just before and after 3000 BC, precisely the turbulent window we explored when Uruk's network came apart. Kish, in other words, was there, growing in size and complexity, at exactly the moment tradition says its kings first appeared. The city's material record shows monumental architecture, administrative activity, and the kind of urban density that would support the kind of centralized authority the king list describes in outline, even if it cannot confirm a single name on that early roster. Somewhere in that gap between a verified city and a list of unverifiable kings, the question of the earliest rulers of Kish remains genuinely, frustratingly open. Why would a king list open with names this strange? Kalibum, meaning roughly little dog; Zukakip, meaning scorpion; Mashta, apparently related to a word for gazelle. Some historians have suggested these were never meant to be read as personal names at all in the way we understand them, but rather as totemic titles or symbolic markers standing in for clans, professions, or something closer to folk memory than genealogy. Fragments of a much older oral tradition that the later scribes inherited, half understood and preserved anyway, rather than lose entirely. Others take a more literal approach, proposing that these were simply the actual names in use during an early period of Sumerian history, whose naming conventions have not survived into any other record we possess, making them look strange to us only because we have nothing else from that era to compare them against. Either explanation leaves the same uncomfortable truth in place. We cannot verify these figures existed as individuals, and we cannot prove they did not. There is a further complication buried within the list itself. Kish's post-Diluvian dynasty, according to the text, was eventually defeated. Its kingship carried off to the city of Etana in Uruk, the very city whose mysterious collapse we examined earlier in this exploration. If the chronology implied by the list holds any historical value at all, it would suggest a far more entangled relationship between these two great early cities than a simple sequence of rise and fall. Uruk's network fragmenting even as Kish rose in its shadow, only for Kish's own kingship to be transferred back toward Uruk once more, in a cycle of shifting primacy the surviving fragments only gesture toward without fully explaining. Was this an actual conquest, remembered and simplified by later scribes into the tidy language of transferred kingship? Or is the entire framework, kingship as a single, portable, almost physical prize passing from city to city, simply the literary device the compilers used to organize an early history they themselves did not fully understand, stitching together fragmentary local traditions from different cities into one continuous artificial narrative? Mainstream Assyriology tends to treat the earliest kings of Kish the way it treats Etana himself, as figures standing at the blurred boundary between authentic historical memory and the mythologizing impulse of a much later age, looking back on its own murky origins. The city was real. Its early prominence was almost certainly real. But the individual men behind names like Kalaibum and Zukakip may be forever unrecoverable, their existence neither confirmed nor disproven by anything the sand of Tel Aluhaymir has yet surrendered. A small number of researchers, working at the more speculative edges of the field, have wondered whether further excavation at Kish, much of the site remains unexcavated even now, might one day produce an inscription bearing one of these names, transforming legend into verified history in a single afternoon's find. It has happened before, at other sites, with other supposedly mythical kings. Until that day, if it comes, the first kings of Kish remain exactly what the wind-scoured mounds above them suggest. Shapes just beneath the surface, close enough to sense, too deep yet to see clearly. What, if anything, still waits down there to tell us who they really were? Kingship as a prize that could be won, lost, and carried off from one city to the next. That unsettling idea from Mesopotamia's earliest chronicles finds its own reflection back on the Nile, in the years before Narmer's mace ever fell. Here, too, the record hints at conquest and rivalry it never fully explains, preserved not in a written king list, but in broken pottery, painted walls, and the scattered iconography of a fractured land learning, violently, how to become one. Before Egypt was Egypt, it was a landscape of competing centers, each with its own emerging identity, its own local elite, and, the evidence increasingly suggests, its own ambitions. In the south, the Naqada culture dominated the Nile Valley from around 4000 BC onward, its influence radiating outward from sites like Naqada itself, Hierakonpolis, and later Abydos. To the north, in the delta and along the Nile's lower reaches, a related but distinct set of communities developed, connected more directly to trade routes reaching into the Levant and the wider eastern Mediterranean. For a long stretch of prehistory, these two worlds coexisted, exchanged goods, and developed along broadly parallel, though not identical, paths. Then, sometime in the centuries before 3100 BC, something shifted. The archaeological signature of southern Naqada-style culture begins appearing at northern sites with increasing frequency, not merely as imported trade goods, but as a wholesale replacement of local material culture, local burial customs, and local artistic styles. To the archaeologists who have spent decades tracing this pattern, the implication is difficult to avoid. This looks like conquest. But conquest by whom exactly, and how contested was it? This is where the trail, as it so often has throughout this exploration, thins into fragments. One of the most tantalizing pieces of evidence comes from a painted tomb at Hierakonpolis, designated Tomb 100 and dated to roughly 3500 to 3200 BC, predating even the scorpion macehead. Its walls, discovered in 1898, preserve the earliest known example of Egyptian tomb painting, a chaotic, still debated scene showing boats, animals, and human figures, including one man striking down several bound captives with a raised mace. Is this a specific historical event, a battle or execution actually witnessed by the tomb's occupant? Or is it, like so much early Egyptian royal imagery, a symbolic assertion of dominance, a ritual template of the smiting of enemies that would recur in Egyptian art for the next 3,000 years, regardless of whether any particular king had smitten anyone that year at all? Once again, we find ourselves unable to distinguish confidently between record and rhetoric. More concrete, though no less puzzling, is the evidence for a specific and violent conflict associated with the transition to the First Dynasty, the possible destruction of a rival northern power center. Some scholars have pointed to a site in the eastern delta and to fragmentary later traditions preserved in Egyptian religious texts, describing a conflict between the followers of the god Horus, associated with the southern Naqada-derived kings, and the followers of Set, whose worship was more closely tied to certain northern and border regions. In later Egyptian mythology, the rivalry between Horus and Set becomes the great cosmic drama of legitimate kingship contested and ultimately resolved. The murder of Osiris, the long struggle between his son Horus and his brother Set, ending in Horus's vindication as rightful ruler. Was this towering myth, retold and elaborated for millennia afterward in temple inscriptions and religious papyri, originally rooted in an actual political and military struggle between rival power centers during Egypt's unification? A real war between real factions, later transfigured into the story of gods rather than kings. Mainstream Egyptology treats this connection as plausible but unprovable, a resonance rather than a documented fact, since no contemporary First Dynasty text explicitly frames the unification in these mythological terms. That framing appears more clearly in sources written centuries later. Yet the persistence of Horus and Set as the two poles of Egyptian kingship, invoked in the titles of pharaohs for the entirety of dynastic history, suggests that whatever lay behind the myth mattered enormously to the Egyptians who inherited it. There is also the question of how many separate campaigns this unification actually required, and how many kings' reigns it may have spanned. The Narmer palette shows a single, decisive-looking victory. But archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Ibrahim Awad and other delta settlements suggests a landscape that did not simply capitulate all at once, and some researchers have proposed that resistance in the north may have continued, in one form or another, well into the reigns of Narmer's immediate successors, Hor-Aha and Djer, kings whose own tomb inscriptions and year labels include scenes that some interpret as records of continued campaigning against northern or eastern populations, rather than a kingdom already fully at peace. If true, the unification of Egypt was not a single triumphant afternoon commemorated on one ceremonial palette, but a longer, messier, and more violent process, stretched across a generation or more, its individual battles and grievances lost to us, remembered only in the aggregate as a single founding myth. What then was this conflict actually like on the ground for the people who lived through it? We have the aftermath, a unified kingdom, a shared royal iconography, a new capital eventually rising at Memphis to bind North and South together. We have the propaganda, in the smiting scenes and the crowns doubled on a single king's head. What we do not have is testimony. No captured soldier's account, no defeated chieftain's lament, nothing to tell us what it felt like to be on the losing side of Egypt's founding. Perhaps that story, like so many others from this age, was simply never recorded. Or perhaps it still lies somewhere in the Delta mud, in a site not yet excavated, waiting to tell us exactly how bitterly and for how long Egypt's two halves resisted becoming one. If any single figure stands at the center of that unresolved war, the general whose victory the Narmer Palet claims to commemorate, the man later tradition may have folded into the legendary Mens. It is Narmer himself. And for a king credited with founding one of history's longest-lived civilizations, remarkably little is certain about how his own story actually ended. Narmer's tomb lies at el-Kab, in the same royal cemetery at Abydos that has anchored so much of this investigation. Designated Tomb B17, B18 by archaeologists, it is a modest structure compared to the monuments his successors would eventually raise, consisting of 2 adjoining chambers cut into the desert floor and lined with mud brick, a king's resting place still closer in scale to the tombs of the chieftains who came before him than to the grand complexes of later pharaohs. Fragments of pottery, ceilings bearing his name, and the remains of grave goods confirm the burial's attribution, even as the tomb itself, like nearly every royal grave from this period, was plundered in antiquity, its more valuable contents long since carried off, its human remains not preserved in any form that allows modern examination. Narmer is present in the archaeological record. The manner of his death is not. What we can reconstruct of his reign comes almost entirely from a handful of objects, each maddeningly incomplete in what it tells us. The Narmer palette itself, with its scenes of conquest and unification, seems to mark the high point of his rule. The moment, or the symbolic representation of a longer process, in which Upper and Lower Egypt came under a single crown. A separate object, the Narmer macehead, discovered like the palette at Hierakonpolis, shows the king enthroned beneath a canopy, presiding over what appears to be a ceremonial event, possibly involving a captive population or a ritual marriage, though the exact scene remains debated among specialists. Ivory labels and pottery sherds bearing his name have turned up not only across Egypt, but as far away as sites in the southern Levant, suggesting a reign engaged in trade and possibly military activity well beyond the Nile Valley itself. Taken together, these fragments describe a king of substantial power and reach. They say nothing about how long he held it, or what finally brought his reign to a close. This is where the question of Narmer's fate becomes genuinely uncertain, and where Egyptologists find themselves working from inference rather than direct evidence. The king who succeeds him in the archaeological sequence at Abydos is Hor-Aha, whose own tomb lies close by and whose reign shows clear continuity with Narmer's. Similar administrative practices, similar royal iconography, and, intriguingly, ceilings that pair the 2 kings' names together in ways some scholars interpret as evidence of a co-regency, a period in which Hor-Aha may have ruled alongside an aging or ailing Narmer before assuming sole power. If this interpretation holds, it would suggest a relatively orderly transition, a planned succession rather than a violent rupture. But the evidence for co-regency in this period is thin and contested, resting on a small number of inscribed objects that can be read in more than one way, and other scholars remain unconvinced that any such arrangement existed at all. More speculative still is a question that has drawn attention precisely because of how little it can be resolved. Was Narmer's rule and his life ended by the same unfinished resistance his own conquest may have provoked? We have already seen evidence suggesting that delta populations may have continued resisting southern rule into the reigns of his successors. If pockets of rebellion persisted into Narmer's later years, it is not unreasonable to wonder whether his reign, or his death, was shaped by that ongoing conflict rather than by peaceful old age. No inscription says so directly, but the timing. A king who spent his reign consolidating a kingdom by force, followed almost immediately by a successor whose own tomb evidence hints at further campaigning, has led some researchers to suggest, cautiously, that Narmer's Egypt may never have been as settled as the triumphant imagery of his palette implies, and that the man himself may have died still governing a kingdom not fully at peace with its own creation. There is, too, a stranger possibility raised by a small number of scholars examining the archaeological sequence at Abydos, that the tomb identified as Narmer's may not represent the entirety of his reign's story, and that discrepancies in the layout and dating of nearby tombs leave room for alternate reconstructions of exactly how and in what order power passed from Narmer to Hor-Aha and beyond. These remain minority positions, built on the same scattered ceilings and pottery fragments that inform every other theory in this period, and they have not displaced the more widely accepted sequence. But they are a reminder of how thin the evidentiary thread really is, holding together a chronology we often speak of with more confidence than the objects themselves can fully support. What survives of Narmer, in the end, is a name carved in the earliest hieroglyphic script, a palette that shows him at the height of his power, and a modest tomb that has kept the details of his final days to itself. He stands, in nearly every account of Egyptian history, as the man who began it all. And yet the closing chapter of his own life remains as unrecorded as the opening chapters of the dynasty he founded. Did he die in peace, the undisputed master of a newly unified land? Or did the kingdom he carved from conflict outlive its own founder's ability to fully hold it together? The tomb at Abydos, robbed of its answers long before any archaeologist arrived to ask the question, keeps its silence still. Among those ceilings that pair Narmer's name with Hor-Aha's, the fragile clay impressions once pressed into jar stoppers and door bolts, sealing off storerooms and tomb chambers now empty, there is another name that appears with startling frequency, bound just as closely to Hor-Aha's own. It is not a king's name. It belongs to a woman, Neithhotep, whose title and role at the very dawn of Egyptian history have puzzled Egyptologists since her tomb was first uncovered in 1897, in the same extraordinary excavation season at Neithhotep that was reshaping our understanding of this entire period. Her tomb, one of the largest and most elaborate structures from the very beginning of the First Dynasty, was originally excavated by Jacques de Morgan, and for decades afterward, was assumed by many scholars to belong to a king in his own right. Its scale seemed to demand nothing less. Only later analysis of the seal impressions found within it clarified that the tomb's occupant was a woman, her name written within a sarek, the rectangular device that in this period was reserved almost exclusively for royalty, framing a king's Horus name above the stylized facade of a palace. That a woman's name should appear inside this specifically royal emblem at this specifically formative moment in Egyptian history is itself remarkable. It suggests that whoever Neithhotep was, she was not merely a royal wife remembered in passing. She was someone the administrative apparatus of the state considered worth marking with the same visual language of kingship used for the men who ruled beside her. The most widely accepted reconstruction places Neithhotep as the wife of Narmer and the mother of Hor-Aha, making her a crucial bridge between the founder of unified Egypt and his successor. Her name appears on ceilings from Hor-Aha's own tomb complex at Abydos, suggesting she remained a figure of significant importance well into her son's reign, not merely a footnote to her husband's. Some Egyptologists have proposed that this continued prominence points to a period of regency, that Hor-Aha may have come to the throne young, and that Neithhotep governed as regent, wielding real administrative and possibly religious authority during a transitional period when the dynasty's hold on its newly unified kingdom was still, as we've seen in earlier chapters of this investigation, far from fully secure. If true, Neithhotep would represent one of the earliest documented instances anywhere in the ancient world of a woman exercising something approaching sovereign power, more than a millennium before names like Hatshepsut would become associated with female authority in Egypt. But how much power, precisely, did she hold? And under what title? This is where the evidence, as it so often has throughout this exploration, resists a clean answer. The sarek bearing her name is unusual not only for including a woman, but for its construction. Some readings interpret it as pairing her name directly with symbols associated with the goddess Neith, a deity linked to warfare, weaving, and, notably, the ancient city of Sais in the western delta, a region that had featured prominently in the earlier conflicts between North and South. Was Neithhotep herself connected by birth to a powerful northern lineage, and was her marriage to Narmer, if that relationship is correctly reconstructed, a strategic union meant to bind a conquered or contested delta population more firmly to the new southern dynasty? Several scholars have found this reading compelling, precisely because it would help explain why a woman of her era received burial honors and administrative recognition on a scale otherwise reserved for kings. She may not have simply married into power, but brought a form of it with her, representing a negotiated peace between two halves of a kingdom still learning to function as one. Other researchers urge caution against reading too much political theory into fragmentary seal impressions, noting that the exact relationships between Narmer, Hor-Aha, and Neithhotep are reconstructed largely from indirect evidence. The co-occurrence of names on sealings, the scale of a single tomb, the presence of a Seqed whose full meaning in this specific case cannot be verified against any surviving text that explains it. It remains possible, these scholars note, that Neithhotep's prominence reflects an important but more conventional royal consort status, elevated by the genuine uncertainty and fluidity of titles and symbols during a period when Egyptian kingship itself was still being defined, rather than evidence of a formal regency or independent rule in the way later better documented queens like Hatshepsut or Sobekneferu would exercise it. The difficulty, as always in this period, is that we are trying to read precise political arrangements out of objects that were never designed to explain themselves to us. What is not in dispute is the scale of the tomb itself, and the unmistakable presence of a royal Seqed bearing a woman's name at the very moment Egypt's first dynasty was taking its permanent shape. Whatever Neithhotep's exact constitutional position, regent, consort, or something not fully captured by any of our modern categories, the evidence leaves little doubt that she mattered immensely to the men who buried her and to the administrators who continued invoking her name and authority for years afterward. Was she the steady hand that held a fragile new kingdom together across a dangerous succession, ruling in fact if not permanently in title? Or does her tomb preserve the honor due a beloved queen, magnified by our own modern eagerness to find powerful women where the evidence is, in truth, more ambiguous than we would like it to be? The sand at Nakada has given us her name and the shape of her authority's outline. It has not yet told us how far that authority truly reached. 3 generations would pass before the question hovering over Neithhotep's tomb returned in an even sharper, even more consequential form. By the time we reach the reign of Den, 5th king of the First Dynasty, Egypt's institutions had matured considerably. Its administration more elaborate, its royal titulary more fixed, its tombs larger and more confidently built. And it is in the shadow of Den's own reign, at el-Ka'ab, that we encounter a tomb belonging to another woman bearing unmistakable royal authority. Merneith, whose grave goods, seal impressions, and even her own entry on later king lists have made her perhaps the single most debated female figure of Egypt's earliest dynastic period. Merneith's tomb, designated Tomb Y at Abydos, sits directly within the royal necropolis, among the graves of the kings themselves, rather than set apart in a separate consort cemetery. It is a substantial structure, surrounded by dozens of subsidiary burials in keeping with the somber funerary customs of this era, and its scale rivals that of the male kings buried nearby. More striking still, seal impressions recovered from the tomb list her name alongside the names of confirmed First Dynasty kings, in a sequence that some scholars have read as placing her directly within the line of royal succession, between the reign of her husband, Djet, and the reign of her son, Den. A stela bearing her name, found in the same funerary complex, was carved without the additional epithets or titles typically used to mark a queen as merely a king's wife or a king's mother, a distinction that has not gone unnoticed by Egyptologists searching for evidence of her actual constitutional standing. The most striking piece of evidence, however, comes from a much later source. The Turin King List, a papyrus compiled more than 1,000 years after Merneith's lifetime during the 19th dynasty, cataloging Egypt's rulers in careful sequence. Fragments of this list, though damaged at precisely the relevant point, appear to include an entry many scholars read as referring to Merneith, positioned within the sequence of First Dynasty rulers in a manner that could suggest later Egyptians remembered her, in some capacity, as a ruling monarch in her own right, rather than simply a royal mother acting temporarily on a child's behalf. If that reading holds, Merneith may represent something even rarer than Neithhotep's possible regency. A woman whose sovereignty was significant enough to be preserved, however faintly, in Egypt's own official memory of its kings, centuries after her death. And yet, as with so much from this period, the evidence permits more than one interpretation. The dominant scholarly reconstruction holds that Den ascended to the throne while still a child, and that Merneith, his mother, governed as regent during his minority, a practical arrangement necessitated by circumstance rather than a formal claim to independent kingship. Under this reading, her prominent tomb, her royal-style stela, and her possible appearance on later king lists reflect the extraordinary but temporary authority granted to a woman managing the machinery of state on behalf of an underage heir, rather than evidence that she was ever crowned or regarded as a king in her own right during her lifetime. Seal impressions from Den's reign do eventually credit him alone as king, which many scholars take as confirming that whatever power Merneith held was transitional, bridging a vulnerable moment in the dynasty's continuity rather than establishing a lasting precedent. Other researchers, working from the same fragmentary material, have pushed further, suggesting that the line between regent and king may itself be a distinction more important to modern historians, seeking clear categories than it was to the Egyptians of this era, for whom royal authority may have been understood more fluidly, especially at a moment when the institution of kingship itself was still comparatively new and its rules of succession not yet rigidly fixed. Under this view, Merneith may not have needed a formal coronation or a permanent title to have functioned, for a period of years, as Egypt's actual ruling power, commanding the resources for a tomb built among kings, commissioning administrative seals bearing her name in a royal context, and directing the affairs of a kingdom still less than a century removed from its violent unification. Whether later, scribes compiling the Turin list understood her this way, or whether her ambiguous appearance there is instead a scribal error or a later garbled memory of an unusual but ultimately subordinate reign, is a question the damaged papyrus itself can no longer settle. What remains, when the competing readings are set side by side, is a woman buried with the honors of a king in the cemetery of kings, whose name may or may not survive on Egypt's own official reckoning of its rulers. Was Merneith a devoted mother who stepped into an unwanted but necessary role, guiding her son's kingdom until he was old enough to rule alone, then quietly stepping back into the more conventional shadow of a queen mother? Or was she something Egyptian tradition had no easy word for yet? A woman who ruled as fully as any king before her, only to have that fact softened and obscured by later generations, less comfortable with the memory of a queen who governed in her own right. Her tomb still stands among the kings at Abydos, exactly where the men who buried her chose to place it. Whether that placement was an honor for service rendered, or a simple statement of fact about who, for a time, truly held Egypt's throne, is a question the sand has kept for itself. Leave the sand of Abydos behind now, and travel back across the desert to Mesopotamia one final time, to the mounds of what was once the city of Kish, the same city whose earliest, half-legendary kings we examined several chapters ago. But we return now to a different, later point in that city's long history, and to a king whose name marks something genuinely rare in this entire investigation. The first ruler on the Sumerian king list, whose existence is confirmed not only by later tradition, but by an inscription he commissioned himself in his own lifetime. His name was Enmebaragesi, and with him, the fog that has surrounded nearly every figure in this exploration begins, however briefly, to lift. The inscription in question is fragmentary, damaged, and was not even recognized for what it was for some time after its initial discovery. But it survives on stone vessel fragments excavated at the site of Nippur, inscribed with a royal name that specialists have identified as Enmebaragesi, King of Kish. This is a detail whose significance is easy to understate. It means that a name appearing on the Sumerian king list, a document we have already seen, blends verifiable history with what looks unmistakably like myth, corresponds to a real, physical object made during or near the actual period of that king's reign. For a document that opens with kings ruling tens of thousands of years and names like little dog, and scorpion among its earliest entries. The emergence of an independently confirmed historical figure feels almost like breaking through to daylight after a long descent underground. According to the king list, Enmebaragesi reigned for some 900 years, a figure that, like the reign lengths attributed to nearly every early king on the document, cannot be taken literally, and instead points to the list's ongoing habit of inflating its earliest, most legendary material, even as it begins, in this same stretch of text, to describe genuinely historical figures. The list credits him with a specific military achievement: subduing the land of Elam, the powerful and often rival civilization to the east, in what would represent one of the earliest recorded instances of interstate warfare anywhere in human history, if the tradition preserves an authentic memory rather than a later embellishment. Is this claim reliable? We have no independent Elamite record to check it against, no rival inscription describing the same conflict from the other side. What we have is a single Mesopotamian tradition, later copied by scribes with their own reasons for celebrating Kish's early martial glory, describing a war we cannot otherwise verify occurred at all, in the form the list describes it. More intriguing still is what the king list says came after Enmebaragesi, his son and successor, a king named Aga, whom later Sumerian literary tradition places in direct conflict with Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, whose own epic would become one of the great literary monuments of the ancient world. A separate Sumerian composition, known to modern scholars as Gilgamesh and Aga, describes a confrontation between the two rulers, with Aga besieging Uruk before ultimately being bested, in the story's telling, by Gilgamesh's cunning and the loyalty of his people. If Enmebaragesi's own historicity is reasonably well established by his inscription, and if his son Aga appears as a named antagonist in a story centered on Gilgamesh, does that mean Gilgamesh himself, long regarded by many scholars as at least partly, if not entirely, a legendary or composite figure, might rest on a firmer historical foundation than previously assumed? This is precisely the question Enmebaragesi's discovery reopened for an entire generation of Assyriologists. The connection does not prove Gilgamesh existed as a single historical man in the way Enmebaragesi apparently did, but it does suggest that the world the Gilgamesh epic describes, its rival cities, its named kings, its remembered conflicts, may be considerably closer to genuine historical memory than the epic's fantastical elements, its demons and its journeys to secure eternal life, would suggest on their own. And yet even Enmebaragesi, our firmest foothold in this entire deep and uncertain landscape, resists full resolution. The inscription bearing his name is damaged, and while the majority of specialists accept the identification, the reading of the royal name on the fragment has not gone entirely unchallenged over the decades since its publication. We possess no burial identified as his with confidence, no tomb at Kish excavated and attributed to him the way Merneith's or Narmer's graves have been identified at Abydos. We do not know the precise years of his reign, only its approximate place in a chronological sequence built largely from other, less certain evidence. He remains, even at his most historically solid, a name attached to a fragment, a war we cannot verify, and a son who may or may not have crossed swords with one of literature's first heroes. What Enmebaragesi ultimately offers this investigation is not a solved mystery, but a glimpse of where the mysteries we have been tracing across 2 river valleys and many centuries begin, ever so slightly, to give way to something more like conventional history, a threshold rather than a destination. Beyond him, the kings of Mesopotamia gradually became more documented, their reigns increasingly corroborated by multiple independent sources. Before him lies everything we have already walked through: the scorpion kings, the shepherd who reached for the sky, the little dog and the gazelle, the queens buried among kings whose true authority we can only guess at. Enmebaragesi's fragment of inscribed stone marks, however faintly, the edge of that fog. What might still lie just beyond it, waiting in some unexcavated mound, to bring the next name into focus? Pause, for a moment, on that image of Aga's army encamped beneath Uruk's walls, and consider what it actually represents. Not two isolated kings clashing in legend, but two fully formed city-states, each with its own ruler, its own walls, its own claim to independence, treating one another as rivals within a shared, recognizable political world. It is worth asking how that world came to exist at all. How a landscape that had once been dominated by a single overwhelming center, Uruk in the centuries we explored earlier in this investigation, transformed into the patchwork of competing, sovereign cities that Enmebaragesi, Aga, and Gilgamesh all belonged to. This is the question of the Sumerian city-state system's own origins, and it may be the deepest and most foundational mystery this entire exploration has yet approached. By the time we reach the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BC, southern Mesopotamia was no longer organized around one dominant urban center radiating outward, as it seems to have been during Uruk's earlier heyday. Instead, the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates had fragmented into a dozen or more independent city-states: Ur, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Nippur, Umma, Eridu, and others, each centered on its own monumental temple complex, each claiming its own patron deity, each ruled by its own line of kings, and each, crucially, walled and fortified against its neighbors in a way that suggests genuine and sustained rivalry rather than peaceful coexistence. How did a single interconnected network give way to this fractured competitive landscape of small sovereign states, each jealously guarding its own independence for the better part of 6 centuries? The archaeological evidence offers some clear signposts. Excavations across the region show a marked increase in city walls during this period, along with weapon caches, fortified gates, and administrative texts increasingly concerned with boundary disputes and territorial claims. One of the most famous surviving documents from the later end of this era, a stone monument known as the Stele of the Vultures, commemorates a prolonged border conflict between the city-states of Lagash and Umma over control of a fertile strip of agricultural land. A dispute so persistent, it apparently continued across multiple generations of rulers on both sides. This is not the record of a unified world gradually settling into peaceful coexistence. It is the record of intensely local, intensely personal rivalries between neighbors who shared language, religion, and material culture, yet fought bitterly over irrigation canals and field boundaries for centuries. What forces could produce, and then sustain, this particular kind of fragmented world? Mainstream explanations tend to center on the environment itself, echoing the same fragile hydrology that may have doomed Uruk's earlier network. Southern Mesopotamia's irrigation-dependent agriculture required constant intensive labor and management, and the region's flat terrain meant that competing communities, drawing water from the same limited network of canals, would inevitably come into conflict as population grew and resources tightened. Under this view, the city-state system was less a deliberate political innovation than an emergent response to ecological pressure. Independent cities formed and fortified themselves because cooperation across the whole plain, once feasible under a single dominant center like early Uruk, became increasingly difficult to sustain as local populations grew more numerous and more protective of their own immediate resources. Scarcity in this telling did not unite the plain. It divided it, city by city, canal by canal. Other scholars point toward more specifically political and religious explanations, noting that each Sumerian city-state was organized, at least in ideology, around the worship of its own patron deity, whose temple functioned as the economic and administrative heart of the community. Some researchers have proposed that this intensely local religious identity, perhaps inherited from an even earlier, pre-Uruk pattern of independent temple communities scattered across the plain, may have provided the underlying template for political fragmentation once Uruk's unifying network weakened. Under this reading, the city-states were not simply a response to environmental pressure, but a reversion to a deeper, older pattern of Mesopotamian social organization that had briefly been overshadowed, but never fully erased, by Uruk's centuries of dominance. If this is correct, then the true origin of the city-state system lies not in the crisis of 3000 BC at all, but centuries earlier, in patterns of local identity we can only glimpse faintly in the archaeological record beneath Uruk's own rise. A smaller number of researchers have raised a more provocative possibility that the competitive, warring city-state system was not merely a consequence of Uruk's decline, but was, in some sense, actively encouraged by it. That surviving elites at the various former Uruk outposts and secondary centers, no longer subordinate to a single dominant authority, found genuine political and economic advantage in maintaining their own independent power bases, rather than seeking to reconstruct anything resembling the earlier unified network. Under this view, fragmentation was not simply something that happened to Mesopotamia, an unfortunate byproduct of ecological or religious forces beyond anyone's control, but something local rulers, once they tasted independent sovereignty, had genuine reason to preserve and defend, walls and all. This remains a minority position, difficult to prove or disprove from the material record alone, but it reframes the entire question in a way worth sitting with. Was the fragmented world of Sumerian city-states a tragedy of decline? Or was it, for those who ruled within it, something closer to a system working exactly as its architects, however unintentionally, had shaped it to work? What we are left with, once again, is a landscape of walls and canals and boundary stones, each speaking to a rivalry we can document but rarely fully explain. Uruk fell, and in its place rose not one successor but many, each guarding its own gods, its own fields, its own sovereignty, for the better part of 600 years. Was this fragmentation forced upon Mesopotamia by a land too fragile to sustain a single center indefinitely? Or did the plains people, once given the chance to rule themselves in smaller, fiercer communities, simply choose never to give that independence up again? The canals have long since silted over, and the walls have crumbled into the same mounded earth that hides so much else from this age. Somewhere within them, perhaps, still lies the answer to how a unified world first learned to divide itself. Leave the walled cities of the Mesopotamian plain behind now, and return one last time to the low desert ridge at Abydos, to a stretch of the royal cemetery older than Narmer's own tomb, older even than the reign the Narmer palette so famously commemorates. It is here, among the very earliest graves at el-Ka'ab, that we find the tomb of a king who occupies one of the strangest positions in all of early Egyptian history. A ruler whose name appears clearly in the archaeological record, whose tomb has been identified with reasonable confidence, and who was, nonetheless, entirely erased from the official memory of the civilization he apparently helped to found. His name, as reconstructed from inscribed pottery and clay ceilings, was Iry-Hor. The case for Iry-Hor's existence rests on a body of evidence that has grown steadily since the late 19th century, though its interpretation has shifted considerably over that time. Sherds bearing his name, written simply as a mouth hieroglyph, and a falcon representing the god Horus, were found by early excavators at Abydos, and for decades some scholars questioned whether Iry-Hor represented an actual royal name at all, or whether it was instead a title, an epithet, or even a misreading of unrelated inscriptions. That uncertainty began to dissolve with further excavation, particularly the work of the German Archaeological Institute under Günter Dreyer, whose team identified a tomb at Abydos, designated B0, containing ceilings and grave goods consistent with a king who reigned before Narmer, in the period Egyptologists now commonly call Dynasty Djer. The tomb is modest by the standards of the kings who followed him, yet unmistakably royal in its context, situated directly among the graves of the rulers who would come immediately after him. Iry-Hor, in other words, appears to have been a real king, buried among real kings, at the literal dawn of Egyptian dynastic history. And yet, when later Egyptians compiled their own official records of their nation's founding kings, the Palermo stone, the Turin king list, and the king lists inscribed on temple walls at Abydos and Karnak centuries afterward, Iry-Hor's name is absent. Narmer, in these later traditions, stands at the very beginning, the first king of the unified nation, exactly as the Narmer palette itself seems to claim. Iry-Hor, along with a small handful of other Dynasty Zero rulers whose names have emerged from the same archaeological digging: Ka, Scorpion, and others we have already encountered in this investigation. Simply does not appear. He is present in the ground and absent from the story. Why would a king substantial enough to warrant a formal tomb, sealed storage jars, and administrative markers bearing his name be so completely excluded from Egypt's own account of its own beginnings? The most widely accepted explanation returns us to a theme this entire investigation has circled more than once. That later Egyptian tradition, compiled many centuries after the events it describes, deliberately simplified and idealized its own founding narrative, collapsing what was almost certainly a longer and messier process of state formation into the story of a single triumphant founder. Under this reading, Iry-Hor and his Dynasty Zero contemporaries ruled during a genuine transitional period, exercising real but perhaps incomplete authority over a kingdom not yet fully unified in the way Narmer's reign would come to represent, and later Egyptians, looking back with the benefit of a cleaner, more useful national myth, simply chose to begin their story where the unification looked most complete and most decisive. Iry-Hor's exclusion in this view is not really about him personally at all. It is about the needs of the story later generations wanted to tell about themselves. Other researchers have proposed a more pointed possibility, that the omission may reflect something closer to a deliberate act of political or religious erasure, comparable to practices Egyptians would employ in later periods against rulers whose legitimacy or memory the state wished to suppress. The way the memory of Akhenaten's controversial reign, more than a millennium later, was similarly excised from king lists compiled by his own successors. Under this reading, Iry-Hor's absence might indicate that his reign, or his branch of the emerging royal family, was ultimately regarded by later kings as illegitimate, incomplete, or simply unworthy of formal commemoration, regardless of the real administrative power he seems to have wielded during his own lifetime. There is no inscription that tells us this directly. The theory rests on pattern and precedent rather than direct evidence, and remains, like so much from this period, a plausible reading rather than a settled fact. What Iry-Hor leaves us with in the end is a peculiar kind of mystery. Not a life obscured by a lack of evidence, but a life confirmed by the ground and denied by the written record, a king who is real to archaeologists and invisible to history. His name, mouth, and falcon pressed into damp clay 4,000 years before anyone would think to dig it up again, tells us that a man ruled, however briefly, over some portion of the land that would become Egypt, and that later Egyptians chose, for reasons they never explained to us, to leave him out of the story entirely. Was he a genuine forerunner whose reign was simply too fragmentary, too regional, to fit the tidy narrative his successors preferred? Or does his silence in the official record hide something closer to deliberate omission, a founding king quietly written out of the founding myth he may have helped create? Somewhere beneath Abydos, in a tomb smaller and humbler than the ones that came after it, Iry-Hor still waits for the rest of Egypt's earliest history to catch up with what the sand has already told us about him. Iry-Hor did not rule Abydos's shadowed prehistory alone. Immediately after him, in the same royal cemetery, in a tomb built directly adjacent to his, archaeologists have identified the resting place of the king who succeeded him, a ruler whose name survives only as a single stark hieroglyph, the sign for a pair of raised arms, read by Egyptologists as Ka. If Iry-Hor's story is one of a king remembered by the ground and forgotten by the record, Ka's is, in many ways, even stranger still. A king whose name is more widely attested across Egypt than his predecessors, and whose fate remains, if anything, even less understood. The evidence for Ka's reign comes from a wider geographic spread than almost any other Dynasty Zero ruler we have examined. His Seqed, the palace facade emblem that would become the standard frame for royal names throughout Egyptian history, appears on pottery vessels not only at Abydos, where his tomb, designated B7-B9, sits beside Iry-Hor's, but also at Tarkhan, at Helwan, near modern Cairo, and most tellingly, at Tel Ibrahim Awad in the eastern delta, one of the very sites whose fortifications and destruction layers have featured in our earlier examination of conflict between Egypt's early kingdoms. If Ka's name genuinely appears there, inscribed on vessels associated with a period of transition and possible violence in that region, it would place him directly at the geographic and chronological heart of the unification process itself. A king reigning at precisely the moment northern and southern Egypt were being drawn, forcibly or otherwise, into a single political system. This wide distribution has led the majority of Egyptologists to treat Ka as one of the most securely attested Dynasty 0 kings, his reign falling in the final years before Narmer's, close enough to the traditional beginning of the first dynasty that some scholars have wondered whether Ka should properly be counted among its founders, rather than relegated to a shadowy pre-dynastic prelude. And yet, exactly like Iry-Hor before him, Ka is entirely absent from the later Egyptian king lists. No mention on the Palermo stone, no entry on the Turin papyrus, no place among the ancestors invoked on temple walls at Abydos or Karnak. A king whose material footprint reaches from the southern royal cemetery to the northern delta frontier simply vanishes from his own civilization's account of itself, in precisely the same way, and for reasons just as unexplained as the king who came before him. What makes K's case especially puzzling is a detail that has emerged from later, more careful excavation of his tomb. Unlike many royal burials of this period, which show clear evidence of ancient plundering, some archaeologists examining tomb B70-B9 have noted features suggesting the burial may have been disturbed and partially reused or reworked relatively soon after its original construction, though the extent and meaning of this disturbance remains debated among specialists working on the site. Was this simply the ordinary ravages of robbery that affected nearly every tomb from this period, no different from what befell Narmer's or Iry-Hor's own graves? Or does it hint at something more specific to Ka's own reign or its immediate aftermath? A disruption in the transfer of power, a hurried or contested burial, evidence of a transition to Narmer's rule that was less smooth than the later triumphant imagery of the Narmer palette would have us believe. The excavated evidence permits the question. It does not permit a confident answer. There is, too, the matter of sequence itself, and here scholarly opinion divides along lines we have already encountered in earlier chapters of this investigation. If Ka reigned immediately before Narmer, was his kingdom already substantially unified, making Narmer's own famous conquest scenes more a ceremonial confirmation of an achievement largely already accomplished than a genuine founding act? Some researchers who track the geographic spread of Ka's Seqed across both halves of the future kingdom have leaned toward exactly this reading, suggesting that the real, difficult work of unification may belong at least partly to Ka and to the Dynasty 0 kings before him, with Narmer inheriting a kingdom substantially assembled by his predecessors and receiving, through fortune or through the particular power of his own later commemoration, the credit later tradition would forever after assign to him alone. If this reconstruction holds, then the story Egypt told about its own founding, a single king, a single triumphant unification, may be less a record of what actually happened, and more a testament to the fact that history, even in its very first written moments, already belonged to whoever controlled the telling of it. Others caution against overreading a scattering of inscribed pottery, noting that Ka's name might have persisted or spread through trade and administrative continuity, even after a more limited or contested actual reign, and that the wide geographic distribution of his Seqed tells us about the reach of his administration, not necessarily the completeness of his political control. The debate, like so many in this investigation, remains genuinely open, resting on a handful of vessels and a partially disturbed tomb, rather than any text willing to explain itself. What ultimately survives of Ka is a name written in raised arms, a tomb built beside his predecessors in the same quiet stretch of desert, and a scatter of pottery reaching farther across Egypt than almost any king we have examined from this age. And, alongside all of it, the same absolute silence in his own civilization's later memory that swallowed Iry-Hor before him. Did Ka die peacefully, his achievements simply absorbed into the greater legend of the king who followed him? Or did his reign end amid exactly the kind of upheaval his disturbed tomb seems to hint at, a transition of power rougher than any surviving stone was ever carved to admit? Two kings now lie side by side at Abydos, both real, both erased, both waiting on the same unanswered question. How much of Egypt's true beginning still lies buried beneath the story it chose, in the end, to tell about itself? Imagine, for a moment, the sound of reed brushes dipped in ochre pigment dragged across the interior wall of a tomb chamber not yet sealed, the scratch of a scribe's tool pressing hieroglyphs into wet clay before it hardens forever. Somewhere in that quiet, industrious moment, a new king's name was being fixed into the permanent record of Abydos, a name that would not be erased, as Iry-Hor's and Ka's had been, but would instead anchor the beginning of Egypt's officially remembered history for every generation that followed. This was Hor-Aha, whose reign, immediately following Narmer's, represents both a moment of relative clarity in our investigation and, paradoxically, one of its most contested puzzles. Hor-Aha's tomb at el-Ka'ab, designated B10, B15, B19, is larger and more architecturally developed than those of his Dynasty 0 predecessors, consisting of 3 connected chambers and surrounded by a substantial number of subsidiary burials, continuing the unsettling practice of retainer sacrifice we examined earlier in this exploration. His name appears with considerable frequency across Egypt, on ivory and wooden labels, on pottery, and crucially alongside the names of both Narmer and Neithhotep in contexts that have fueled decades of debate over the precise structure of his family and his path to the throne. Later Egyptian tradition, including the historian Manetho's king lists compiled some 3,000 years afterward, appears to identify Hor-Aha closely with the legendary Menes, the very question we explored near the beginning of this investigation, leaving open the possibility that the founding glory attributed to that shadowy figure may belong not to Narmer at all, but to the son who consolidated what his father had begun. What makes Hor-Aha's reign so consequential is the evidence suggesting he presided over the practical, administrative birth of a unified Egyptian state, whatever the exact military credit assigned to Narmer before him. Wooden and ivory labels from his tomb complex record events from his reign in a form that represents some of the earliest true historical annals in Egyptian history. Mentions of religious festivals, the construction of buildings, and, most intriguingly, what many scholars interpret as a military campaign against Nubia to the south, recorded through images of a bound captive alongside Hor-Aha's name. If this reading is correct, it would suggest that even as Egypt's rulers worked to consolidate the union between north and south along the Nile, they were simultaneously pushing the boundaries of the kingdom outward into contested territory that would remain a site of Egyptian military and economic interest for the next 3,000 years. Was this campaign a genuine conquest, establishing early Egyptian control over Nubian trade routes and resources? Or was it, like so much royal iconography from this period, a symbolic assertion of dominance that exceeded what was actually and permanently achieved on the ground? The label itself, small and cryptic, offers only the barest outline of an event we cannot fully reconstruct. More troubling still is a discovery made within Hor-Aha's own tomb complex, in a subsidiary structure attached to his main burial. The remains of what may be a young lion, buried alongside the human retainers who accompanied the king into death. The presence of an animal of this kind, evidently significant enough to warrant careful burial near the king himself, has prompted considerable speculation about the symbolic or even literal role such creatures played in the earliest expressions of Egyptian royal power, whether Hor-Aha, or the court that buried him, intended the lion as a guardian for the afterlife, an embodiment of royal ferocity, or something more specific to a now-lost ritual practice that later Egyptian religion would abandon or transform beyond recognition. No text explains the lion's presence. It simply lies there in the archaeological record, another fragment of meaning we can describe, but not fully translate. There is also the matter of Hor-Aha's own death, and the transition that followed it, a question complicated by exactly the same kind of retainer sacrifice that surrounds so many of these early royal burials. The subsidiary graves around his tomb, containing dozens of individuals interred at what appears to be the same time as the king himself, raise once again the difficult question of how, precisely, a ruler's death triggered the deaths of his household, whether these individuals died willingly, as an act of devotion or duty, or whether the practice, however it was justified within the belief systems of the time, involved a form of coercion we can only imagine from a distance of 5,000 years. Some researchers have wondered whether the scale of Hor-Aha's retainer burials, larger than his immediate predecessors, reflects a deliberate escalation of royal ideology under his reign specifically, an attempt to project an image of absolute command over life as much as over land, to a kingdom whose loyalty, given everything we have already examined about the violence of unification, may still have been far from secure. What we are left with, at the close of Hor-Aha's reign, is a king more thoroughly documented than nearly any who came before him, and yet still surrounded by questions his own inscriptions decline to answer. Did he complete his father's conquest, or begin one of his own into Nubia? Did his mother Neithhotep truly guide his early rule, or does that reconstruction ask more of a handful of seal impressions than they can honestly bear? What did the lion beside him mean to the people who placed it there? Hor-Aha's tomb, larger and more confident than those that came before it, marks a civilization visibly gathering strength and permanence around itself. And still, beneath all that new solidity, the same old darkness persists, waiting, as it has at every turn of this investigation, for someone to finally bring a light down into it. That same custom of the small ivory and wooden label, the tiny inscribed tag once tied to a jar or a bolt of linen, recording a single year's notable event in miniature, did not end with Hor-Aha. It continued, generation after generation, into the reign of his descendant Den, fifth king of the first dynasty and the son of Merneith, whose own contested authority we examined several chapters ago. And among the labels that survive from Den's reign, preserved today in museum collections in London, Cairo, and Berlin, is a small but extraordinary set of images. The earliest scenes of Egyptian military conflict detailed enough to let us begin, cautiously, to ask not just whether Den went to war, but against whom and why. Den's reign, generally placed in the final decades of the 31st century BC, is by far the best documented of any First Dynasty king we have examined in this investigation. His tomb at el-Ka'ab, larger and more architecturally sophisticated than any that preceded it, includes the earliest known use of a granite floor in Egyptian royal architecture and a staircase entrance that represents a genuine innovation in tomb construction, suggesting a reign both long and prosperous enough to fund real experimentation in how a king should be buried. It is against this backdrop of confident established power that Den's military record becomes so intriguing, because unlike the ambiguous smiting scenes of earlier kings, several of Den's labels appear to name specific enemies and specific locations, rather than offering only the generic, ritualized imagery of royal dominance. One label, now held in the British Museum, shows Den in the traditional pose of a king striking down a bound enemy, but includes an inscription many Egyptologists read as identifying the defeated figure as an Easterner, and associates the scene with a place name some scholars connect to the Sinai Peninsula or the borderlands beyond Egypt's eastern frontier. If this reading holds, it would place Den at the head of one of the earliest recorded Egyptian military campaigns beyond the Nile Valley itself, a push into the mineral-rich Sinai region that would remain economically vital to Egypt, particularly for turquoise and copper, for the next 3,000 years. Was this a punitive raid against nomadic populations threatening Egyptian mining expeditions or trade routes? A more deliberate campaign of territorial expansion? Or, as with so many of the smiting scenes we have already examined throughout this investigation, a largely symbolic assertion of royal power over a frontier region Egypt's rulers wished to claim rather than one they had fully subdued? The label offers a scene, a location, and a king's triumph. It does not offer the campaign's actual strategic purpose or its lasting outcome. More puzzling still is a separate set of inscriptions that appear to describe conflict much closer to home, within Egypt's own borders, hinting at unrest that some scholars connect to the same lingering northern resistance we explored earlier in this investigation. The possibility that the Delta's absorption into a unified kingdom remained genuinely contested for a generation or more after Narmer's original campaigns. If Den, 3 or 4 kings removed from the original unification still found it necessary to campaign against pockets of internal resistance. What would that suggest about the true stability of the kingdom his predecessors were credited with founding? Was Egypt, even a full human generation into the First Dynasty, still not entirely at peace with itself? Mainstream Egyptology tends to treat these internal campaigns cautiously, since the fragmentary nature of the labels makes it genuinely difficult to distinguish between a real suppression of rebellion and a ceremonial reenactment of the founding conquest, performed periodically by kings eager to reaffirm their legitimacy through the same potent imagery their ancestors had used to establish it in the first place. There is also the matter of a peculiar and much debated label showing Den engaged in a ritual described by the accompanying inscription as the first occurrence of smiting the Easterners, language that some scholars have read quite literally, as evidence that this specific campaign genuinely was unprecedented, the first Egyptian military action of its kind beyond the traditional boundaries of the unified kingdom. Other researchers caution that first occurrence phrasing appears attached to several different ritual events across Den's long reign, describing religious ceremonies as much as military ones, and may reflect a formal, ritualized vocabulary for marking significant royal firsts, rather than a literal historical claim that no Egyptian king had ever fought beyond the Nile Valley before this specific moment. Once again, the label offers us a phrase tantalizing enough to build a theory upon, and just ambiguous enough to prevent that theory from ever becoming certain. What Din's wars ultimately leave us with is our clearest surviving glimpse yet of early Egyptian military activity, and still, somehow, no fully coherent picture of what these conflicts actually meant for the kingdom experiencing them. Was Den a genuine innovator, the king who pushed Egypt's ambitions beyond the Nile Valley for the first time and secured the eastern resources his successors would depend on for millennia? Was he still, 100 years or more after Narmer, fighting to hold together a union that had never been as complete as the founding monuments claimed? Or are we, once again, reading too much specific history into images and inscriptions crafted primarily to project an idealized ritual vision of kingship, rather than to record actual events with anything resembling modern documentary precision? The labels survive, small and precise and stubbornly incomplete, describing just enough of Den's wars to make us certain something significant happened along Egypt's frontiers during his reign, and not nearly enough to tell us, with any real confidence, what that something truly was. 2 generations earlier than the wars we have just examined, before Den ever inherited the throne his mother Merneith may have guarded on his behalf, another king lay dying in a tomb chamber at Abydos larger than any built before it. A king whose reign laid much of the administrative and religious groundwork Den himself would later build upon, and whose own death remains one of the strangest unresolved questions in this entire investigation. This was Djer, 3rd king of the First Dynasty, whose tomb would later come to hold a significance in Egyptian religious memory far beyond what his own contemporaries could have anticipated. Djer's tomb at el-Kab is among the largest and most elaborately provisioned of the early royal burials, surrounded by well over 300 subsidiary graves, the largest single collection of retainer burials associated with any First Dynasty king. The sheer scale of this attendant burial has struck generations of Egyptologists as remarkable even against the unsettling backdrop we have already explored in earlier chapters, and it raises again, in its most extreme form, the question of what kind of authority, or what kind of fear, could compel or persuade so many individuals to accompany a single king into death. Was Djer's reign one of unusual internal stability, prosperous and secure enough to fund a funerary retinue on this scale purely as an expression of confident royal ideology? Or does the scale itself hint at something closer to compulsion, a demonstration of absolute command exercised with particular severity under this specific king? Djer's own reign, which later Egyptian tradition remembered as unusually long, appears from surviving labels and inscriptions to have been a period of significant military and economic activity, including further campaigns into Sinai and possibly into Nubia, continuing the pattern of frontier expansion that Den would later extend. A label from his reign, found at Abydos, appears to depict a military engagement with accompanying hieroglyphs some scholars have connected to Libya to Egypt's west, suggesting a king whose ambitions, like those of his descendants, reached outward in multiple directions from the Nile Valley's still consolidating core. Yet for all this apparent vigor, the circumstances of Djer's own death remain entirely unrecorded in any inscription that has survived. We know from the existence of his tomb and its provisioning that he died as reigning king, presumably after a substantial reign. We do not know how or precisely when or under what circumstances that reign came to its end. What makes Djer's case genuinely strange, rather than merely undocumented, is what happened to his tomb roughly 25 centuries after his death, deep into Egypt's later dynastic history. By the time of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after Djer had been buried and largely forgotten as an individual historical figure, his tomb at Abydos had come to be identified by the Egyptians of that much later era as the tomb of Osiris himself, the god of death, resurrection, and the afterlife, whose myth had by then become the central religious drama of Egyptian civilization. Pilgrims traveled to Abydos specifically to visit this site, leaving offerings and votive objects dedicated not to a long-dead First Dynasty king, but to a god they believed was genuinely buried there. A statue of a reclining figure, added to the tomb during this later period of religious reuse, was fashioned in the pose associated with Osiris's own mythological death and mummification. Why would an obscure early king's tomb, its original occupant's name and deeds largely lost to popular memory within a few centuries of his death, come to be identified so specifically and so enduringly with the central death and resurrection myth of the entire Egyptian religious system? Some scholars propose a relatively straightforward explanation, that Djer's tomb, among the oldest and most physically impressive structures in the royal cemetery, simply became, through the ordinary erosion of accurate memory over 1,000 years, a natural focal point for a religious tradition seeking a physical, tangible location to anchor its central myth, regardless of who had actually been buried there originally. Under this reading, the identification tells us more about later Egyptian religious needs than about Djer himself, a case of sacred geography attaching itself to whatever suitably ancient and impressive ruin happened to be available. Other researchers, working at the more speculative edges of this question, have wondered whether the identification preserves some genuine, if badly distorted, folk memory of Djer's own death. Whether something about the actual circumstances of his passing, violent, unusual, or otherwise remarkable enough to be remembered even after his name was largely forgotten, made his tomb a plausible candidate for this association in a way that other, equally ancient royal graves at Abydos were not. This remains an argument built on absence rather than evidence, an attempt to explain silence by assuming it hides something significant rather than simply reflecting the ordinary erosion of a very old memory. No inscription supports it directly, and it should be weighed as speculation rather than established fact. What we are left with in the end is a king whose life is reasonably well documented, whose death is entirely unknown, and whose tomb became, against every ordinary expectation, one of the holiest sites in Egyptian religion for 2,000 years afterward. Did the accident of scale and location alone transform Djer's resting place into the tomb of a god? Or does that transformation encode some genuine ancient memory of the man himself, garbled by 1,000 years of retelling until only the sacred shape of his death remained? Djer's tomb still lies at Abydos, holding both a king's forgotten end and a god's imagined beginning, and offering no clear way to tell where one mystery finishes and the other begins. That reclining statue, added so many centuries after Djer's death to mark his tomb as the resting place of a god, was not the only remarkable object archaeologists would recover from this stretch of the Abydos necropolis. Just a short distance away, in the tomb of the king who succeeded Djer, excavators uncovered a very different kind of monument. Not a later addition freighted with borrowed religious meaning, but an original piece of funerary art carved during the king's own lifetime, meant to mark his tomb and proclaim his identity to eternity. This was the great stela of Djet, fourth king of the First Dynasty, and it remains one of the most striking and most studied objects to survive from Egypt's earliest historical period. The The stela itself, now held in the Louvre, is a masterwork of early Egyptian relief carving, a tall slab of limestone bearing a single, powerful image, a serpent coiled beneath the palace facade Seqed that frames the king's Horus name, the whole composition topped by the falcon god Horus himself, wings folded, standing guard over the name of the king he protects. It is a work of remarkable artistic confidence for an object carved barely 2 centuries after Egypt's unification, evidence of a royal workshop already capable of producing imagery that would remain recognizably, unmistakably Egyptian in style for the following 3,000 years. And yet, for all the confidence of its craftsmanship, the stela tells us almost nothing about the man it commemorates beyond his name and his claim to divine protection. Djet's own death, like so many we have examined in this investigation, is left entirely outside the frame. What we do know of Djet's reign suggests a king consolidating rather than dramatically expanding the kingdom he inherited, continuing the administrative patterns established by Djer and preparing, whether he knew it or not, the way for the far more thoroughly documented reign of his son Den. His tomb at Kab, while smaller than Djer's in its retinue of subsidiary burials, still contains a substantial number of attendant graves, and its architecture shows continued refinement in the construction techniques Egyptian builders were still, at this early stage, actively developing. Ivory and wood labels from his reign record religious festivals and administrative events in the same terse, tantalizing style we have encountered throughout this period. Fragments of a chronicle that describe the texture of a reign without ever quite explaining its ending. It is precisely this absence that has made Djet's death a subject of ongoing, careful speculation among Egyptologists. Speculation grounded not in any direct evidence of foul play or unusual circumstance, but in the broader pattern of uncertainty surrounding his immediate family. His presumed successor was not, as might be expected, an adult heir ready to assume the throne without incident, but his son, Djen, a king whose mother, Merneith, we have already examined at length in this investigation, and whose own tomb and inscription suggest a period of regency during Den's early years on the throne. If Den was indeed a minor at the time of his father's death, what does that suggest about the circumstances of Djet's own passing? Did he die of natural causes after a reign of ordinary length, leaving behind a young son whose mother capably managed the transition, exactly as later Egyptian custom would come to expect of a royal widow? Or does the need for a regency at all hint at a death that came earlier, or more suddenly, than the normal course of a king's reign would have anticipated? A passing that left the machinery of the state scrambling to accommodate an heir not yet ready to rule. Mainstream Egyptology tends toward the more cautious reading, noting that royal minorities were not necessarily evidence of unexpected or premature death, since ancient marriage and childbearing patterns could easily produce a young heir, even from a king who died at a reasonably advanced age himself. Under this view, Merneith's regency reflects an entirely ordinary demographic reality of the ancient world, rather than any specific mystery attached to Djet's own end. Other researchers, working from the broader pattern of instability and internal resistance we have traced across several chapters of this investigation. The possibility of continued unrest inherited from the unification wars, the scale of retainer sacrifice suggesting a court still governed as much through fear as through settled tradition, have wondered whether a king's death in this period, even one that left no trace of violence in the archaeological record, might still have occurred amid political pressures we simply cannot recover from a handful of labels and a single, beautiful stela. There is also the matter of the stela's own placement and purpose, a detail scholars continue to debate. Some believe it originally stood as one of a pair flanking the tomb's entrance, a common practice for later royal burials, meaning that whatever additional information its lost companion might have carried, a fuller titulary, perhaps additional context about the king's final years, has been gone for as long as archaeologists have known to look for it. What remains is a single magnificent fragment, a serpent, a falcon, a name, and nothing more. Djet's stela endures today as one of the finest surviving expressions of early dynastic Egyptian art, admired by visitors to the Louvre who often know little of the uncertain history behind it. The king it commemorates governed a kingdom still finding its footing, fathered a son too young, it seems, to rule alone, and departed that kingdom without leaving behind a single word to explain how or why his reign came to its close. Was his death simply the quiet, unremarkable end of an ordinary reign, remembered regency and all? Or does the silence surrounding it conceal something the beautifully carved serpent beneath his name was never meant to reveal? The stela still stands, guarding a name it protects far more completely than it explains. There's a particular silence that settles over the Egyptian Museum in Cairo after the crowds have thinned. A silence broken only by the low hum of climate control units working to preserve what time has already tried, and failed, to destroy. Somewhere within that hush lies a face. Desiccated, dark, frozen mid-expression for 35 centuries. The mouth is open, not in the serene repose of the other royal mummies that surround it, hands crossed peacefully over their chests, but twisted, as if caught in the final second of something unbearable. This is the face of Seqed II, a pharaoh the ancient Egyptians themselves remembered by another name, the Brave. He ruled a fractured Egypt sometime around 1558 to 1553 BC, during the final years of the 17th Dynasty, a period when the pharaoh's authority did not extend across the whole of the Nile. To the north, in the city of Avaris, sat the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty of rulers believed to have originated in the Levant, who had come to dominate Lower Egypt more than a century earlier. Seqed governed the south from Thebes, technically a vassal, paying tribute to a king he had never chosen. It was, by most accounts, an uneasy peace. And peace, as history so often demonstrates, rarely survives an insult. The surviving account, fragmentary, damaged, preserved on a papyrus known today as the Quarrel of Apophis and Seqed, describes something almost absurd in its pettiness. The Hyksos king Apophis, some 400 miles away in Avaris, is said to have sent word that the roaring of hippopotami in a sacred pool near Thebes was disturbing his sleep, and demanded the pool be destroyed. Whether this was a genuine complaint or a calculated provocation designed to test the southern king's obedience, no one can say for certain. What we do know is that shortly afterward, Seqed was dead, and the manner of his death would remain a mystery for 35 centuries. His mummy was discovered in 1881 in the Deir el-Bahari cache, a hidden royal tomb where priests of a later era had gathered dozens of pharaohs' remains to protect them from tomb robbers. When Seqed's wrappings were finally removed in 1886, what researchers found stopped them cold. The skull bore multiple wounds, a deep gash above the right eye, a fracture at the base of the skull, cuts across the cheek and nose. This was not the sanitized death of a king who passed peacefully in his palace. This was violence, deliberate and repeated. For over a century, Egyptologists debated what these wounds meant. Was Seqed struck down in his sleep, the victim of a palace conspiracy, perhaps orchestrated by rivals within his own court, killed by assassins who crept close enough to reach him with a dagger while he lay unguarded? Or did he die, as legend suggested, at the head of his own army, cut down in the opening skirmishes of the war that his son and grandson would eventually finish? A war that eventually expelled the Hyksos from Egypt entirely and gave rise to the new kingdom. In 2021, a team from Cairo University led by radiologist Sahar Salim, working alongside renowned Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, turned to computed tomography to look beneath the embalming resin for answers modern eyes had never seen. What the scans revealed only deepened the intrigue. The king's hands were found bent and rigid in a position inconsistent with the usual crossed-arm burial pose of Egyptian royalty. A phenomenon consistent with cadaveric spasm, a rare physiological reaction in which a body seizes at the exact moment of a violent, high adrenaline death. There were no defensive wounds on his forearms. None. For a man supposedly cut down mid-battle, sword in hand, that absence is difficult to explain. It suggests instead that Seqed's hands may have already been bound behind his back, that he did not die fighting, but as a prisoner. The CT scans identified injuries from at least 5 distinct weapons, compared against Hyksos-era battle axes and daggers recovered from the site of Tel el-Daba. The pattern of damage, concentrated, repeated, aimed squarely at the face, points toward something closer to ritualized execution than the chaos of open combat. A king, perhaps captured after his forces were overrun, brought before his enemies not to be killed quickly, but to be humiliated in death, struck again and again by more than one hand. And yet questions remain that no scanner has been able to answer. Why was his brain never removed during mummification, a step considered essential by embalmers of his era? Was it, as some researchers have quietly wondered, because the extent of the trauma made the procedure impossible or unbearable? Why does his mummification bear the marks of careful, skilled work, rather than the hurried preservation one might expect of a body recovered far from home, days after death, in the heat of an Egyptian summer? Who exactly carried his body back to Thebes? And did they know, as they wrapped him, that his death would ignite the very war that reshaped Egyptian history? The face in that quiet Cairo gallery has kept its expression for 3,500 years, and it is not offering any of us an easy answer. Somewhere between the palace and the battlefield, between conspiracy and combat, the truth of that final morning still waits, bound perhaps as tightly as the king's own wrists were said to be.